Good evening. Today is July 12th, and it is 6:30, and I officially called the meeting to order. Sylvia, do you need to do roll call?
Chair Meyer?
Yes.
Rachel? Yes. Doug Scott?
Here.
Larry O'Keefe?
Here.
Naomi Bellas? Thank you. And absent is Beth Cook?
Yes. And Nancy Burt?
And Nancy Burton. Yes, thank you.
Unfortunately, given the timing of our most recent meeting, we do not have minutes for approval today. So we will go ahead and postpone that review until Thursday. However, in an effort just to brief everyone on our upcoming meeting schedule, we do have that posted in this agenda. As a reminder, on Thursday the 18th, we'll be meeting at 5:30 as opposed to 6:30. And now we can begin our new business. The first thing, Rachel and I talked a little bit after our last meeting on Wednesday about public comment. And we felt like it was important to address that as a committee because we have such a small window of opportunity to get a lot of work done. We felt like it might be worthwhile to have a conversation about limiting timing of public comment, perhaps considering opening public comment up at the beginning of our meetings as opposed to toward the latter part of the evening so that we could reflect on citizen comments and that sort of thing. We'd like your thoughts.
I'll renew my comments from previous meeting that I think public comment is important. I value it. I agree that having it at the beginning of the meeting would be preferable because if ideas come to us then about whatever topic we're discussing that night, we can reflect on those ideas and incorporate them into our discussion with an overall time limit if possible, as well as an individual time limit. I also think that we should, as much as possible, try to keep comments related only to the topics on the agenda for that evening. So if that's allowed and possible, I would strongly encourage that to be a requirement of each meeting specific public comment period.
Okay.
I would agree with that, with having public comments before the meeting so that if they bring up any ideas. My only concern is that we have a lot different crowd than we had the other night. So for people that come in late, I don't know if we could, I don't want to get too many public comments out, but as long as we make that known that the public comments will be at the beginning of the meeting and maybe tonight we can be flexible if people show up late or something. But
Okay. Do you have any different?
No, I agree.
Okay, great. Well, let's begin. Do you want to? Nope. Okay. In light of that, is there anyone here tonight that would like to say anything? And let us know. Okay. So let's move on to item number 6 on our agenda. And I will ask Heather to perhaps brief us on the questions that were posed at Wednesday's meeting.
I'm Heather Martin from the City of Hammond, who acts as a city attorney. So I don't come to the meetings regularly, but I will be here tonight, obviously, and then I will be back on Monday as well. But so bear with me because I wasn't at last Wednesday's meeting. What we'll do is just kind of work through, as like we have been here in the agenda. I just want to talk generally about the first item here, which is overnight camping, overnight parking of vehicles and RVs, motorhomes, and then dilapidated vehicles. We have used a number of different ordinances to look at different ideas of what different cities are doing. So preliminarily, one of the issues that you would probably need to resolve, and we'd want to clarify this, is right now in your code, in the Sherwood Municipal Code, in section 16.22.020, there's a table of uses that's listed there. And right now, it says that RV storage is not permitted in any of the commercial zones. There's no definition of storage. So, I mean, we could interpret that to mean, you know, it doesn't mean you can park it there for a long period of, you know, a certain period of time. So that's one thing that, just keeping that in mind in the back of your head in terms of recreational vehicles specifically. I think before you went farther down that road, we would want to check with the planning staff and just get a sense of whether you have any, it doesn't directly address RV parks per se. So this is this general prohibition that's in all of your commercial zones, but there's no mention of RV parks. So we would really want to, you know, if there are areas in the city where there are RV parks, you know, we would want to make sure that that interpretation of storage is not impacting them. But we would want to get more information from planning about if there is a park, what zone are they in? You know, they might not be in the commercial zone, so you know it's not an issue. But so that's one of the sort of preliminary questions that we have for staff.
Well, it looks to me, Heather, that in section 10 of our code under vehicles and traffic, there is under 10.08.030 some parking restrictions already identified that do address parking for motorhomes, travel trailers, and that sort of thing. But you're right, I would agree. It doesn't appear that there's a real definition of what camping might entail or durations of parking might be and that sort of thing. So, did you want to add that?
Yeah, if this is the same, the section you quoted is the same as that I read, my concern with that was it specifically applied to public areas and residential areas, but not commercial. And so whether we try to append or add that to that section or whether we create, I think it was suggested the other night, we might be better off creating an existing or a new ordinance that applies specifically to commercial. So some clarification around that would be helpful too.
So one other issue to consider as well is looking at the approval for the development and making sure there wasn't specifically any explicit approval or allowance of having a recreational vehicle. I did a really quick search right before I came, and I didn't find anything, but that's also something that we need to look at first to make sure, I mean, if there's something already in the development approval, the land use file, basically stating, you know, if they came to the city saying they wanted to be able to park RVs in the parking lot overnight, that they wanted that to be allowed. That's something you would have to look at too. So Cornelius, they, in their land use development approval for a Walmart, they specifically put as a condition, you know, through that process that they were not allowed. So you'd want to do a little bit more research on that front and just double check the planning file to make sure that there isn't anything there that would prohibit you from maybe enacting some of the types of ordinances that we gave you examples of. And that's sort of just a sort of overview of where you already are in the city. So basically you were left with the RV storage language in the development code. And I guess also, you know, in interpreting that, it would be nice to know how the city, if they've interpreted it in the past. And I don't know if Tom can speak to that.
I can. Believe it or not, which is unusual. That's a pretty complicated question. So, first off, I'm not absolutely certain, but pretty certain that this wasn't addressed in the land use decision as far as storage or RV parking. So, second off, one thing Heather doesn't know that we talked about, that any changes to Section 16 probably wouldn't really necessarily fall under this committee because of the timing issues with DLCD notice and having to go through planning commission and public hearings and everything else. But we have had interpretations done not too very long ago because we're having some issues with RV storage and people wanting to redefine what RV storage was. And we certainly didn't make any interpretations that would have indicated to me that it would have addressed camping or that type of thing on private property. So it would seem to me like I think Heather's cautions are good, that we definitely need to check those things, but I think if we were going to proceed, we probably would want to proceed with something outside of Chapter 16 and just make sure whatever we do doesn't conflict with what might have been there. But I can say with pretty much certainty that we have already dealt with the storage issue, and it certainly didn't include anything like overnight. Plus, the other problem with Chapter 16 is, now you're in the land use violation. So if somebody's camping overnight, you very well can't have code compliance apply any sort of penalty that would have any sort of it would actually, if it's land use, it would probably go to the developer, not necessarily to an individual who happened to, have a camper or something on the property. So I think there would be a lot of technical issues with trying to manage that under Chapter 16 without pretty much changing the way that the penalties were applied, and then really that doesn't really belong to Chapter 16, in my opinion.
Well, one issue that you could look at, though, is having an actual planning commission interpretation of that term, instead of actually changing the development code and going through, because it's a pretty long process, but just having, and I don't know if your code has a interpretation provision where the planning commission can actually, first we need to check and see if they've done it in the past, like an official interpretation of what it means. But that was I just wanted to put that out there, and I do know, that would be, to actually change it, to change the code, through the development code, that's going to be a long process.
Yeah, given Tom expressed that as a concern, one of the things that Chad indicated on Wednesday was that we could potentially look at expanding the city of Sherwood, or not even expanding, but adding another ordinance in regard to nuisances, in which we could perhaps include oversized vehicle, like the city of Ashland, for example. They've got some methods of parking and parking regulations that would appear to be pretty helpful in terms of creating, perhaps for our reasons, a district in which we are looking at a larger area that might be referred to as our core or a town center or something along those lines for the promotion and well-being of that core area.
You also have, so my next step, when I was just looking what you already have in your code, you already have section 8.04, which you could expand that. That deals with abandoned, discarded, and hazardously located vehicles. That would be, if you really want to get into more of the specifics and incorporating some of the provisions that you see in some of those other ordinances, that might be somewhere where you could look at actually changing the code, and you wouldn't have to go through the development code to change process. So,
and that was what section?
8.04, and it's abandoned, discarded, and habitually located vehicles.
Okay.
Can I ask a question about who's currently on staff to enforce the code for this, if there's a RV vehicle?
Well, it somewhat depends. There are certainly, we have police that are able to write tickets and do things that are more of a timely nature that are covered. We also have a code compliance officer. His name's Bill Collins. And so he handles all sorts of different kinds of nuisance complaints and code violations of the planning code. So he covers a wide range of things that the police officer couldn't necessarily do by just writing a ticket that's expressly allowed to do in the code. He writes tickets as well, but it's a little bit different. He's looking at more of the things that have been there for a week or a year, or the grass is too high or whatever. So that's how that's happening.
So what I'm hearing is making a modification or a change to the development code, given timing issues and notice issues, as that may not be applicable. One of the things that we could potentially look at is the city motor vehicles code, and we can include some language revising that area so that, again, I mean, the goal of promoting positive visibility and all of those things that I mentioned earlier could happen. Is that a yes, or?
So you can look at, and look at expanding it, and, looking at those other ordinances is a way for you to look at saying, this is something we want to look at, we like this section of, this ordinance. And we can, that's sort of my next step here, is to get into some of the ordinances that we provided. But
Okay.
I don't know if you want to talk more generally first before.
Well, I just wanted to make sure that we have an understanding. In the your office provided to council on I think June 3rd during the work session some of the work that you looked at previously in regard to some of the proposed ordinances. So I just want to make sure that we've got that clear, that looking at amending or modifying the motor vehicles code is something that is an option.
I mean, it's an option, definitely, to modify it.
Okay.
And what we would want to do is when we get down to the nitty-gritty of what exactly you want to do and which changes you want to enact,
Okay.
just making sure that none of them are contrary to the state
Got it.
motor vehicle code or any other state law. So once we get into more of the specifics, it'll be, easier to give you a better idea of those types of restrictions. Or
Okay.
So just to make sure that it's clear, if an ordinance is enacted, essentially that changes the code. And so you can change a portion of the code, or you can change a whole section, you can add a section. But the way to change the municipal code is to do it by ordinance. So resolutions which are passed don't change the municipal code, ordinances do. And so if we do an ordinance, you can go into a section of code and modify, add or delete, or change particular items within that code, add completely different sections, or manage it that way. So that's essentially what the process would be in order if you wanted to change section 10 to add, commercial properties to the public. You would essentially do that by ordinance. The ordinance would be passed, and then Sylvia coordinates with every one to get the municipal code actually changed that way.
So am I correct in hearing that going into an existing section of code and modifying it or adding to it is one way we could proceed immediately? Another one would be coming up with the gist of what we want to do and then having the attorneys then actually figure out where that impacts code and comes back to us. And maybe that's a more efficient approach for us and in our time frame.
yeah, and I think that's probably the best way to go, is just saying you want, these types of provisions, and they could already be in your code in certain areas, so it's A, making sure that they don't already exist, and then B, making sure that, when you make code changes, you want to make sure that they're consistent throughout. So, you're changing one section and maybe it impacts another section, so you end up going a little broader than you originally intended, but, those are the types of things that you need to be cognizant of as we move through the process. So it is a little more time-consuming, even than just resolution, as we were saying. When you're going through and amending the code, you want to make sure that you're doing it in a consistent manner. So,
Is there, can we have access to the developer's letter of intent, maybe to see if they did request to have RVs parked there? Would that be
I don't believe we have a copy of that. That would be a private transaction.
Oh, okay.
So
what was the document that you're referring to where they would have outlined what they needed to have?
The site plan application or the PUD or?
Yeah, that would have been through the site plan application process, where they would have in their application, address some code section through their narrative that would have then been reviewed and then would have, received some sort of comments or condition ultimately that would have addressed that. But I'm pretty sure that it wasn't spelled out in their application and it wasn't addressed in the
Yeah, and I read through the entire finalized site plan agreement or site plan approval from the Planning Commission. or at least skimmed most of it and read the parts that I found more interesting. And I didn't see anything about that, but I assume we could have council double check that online.
That'd be good. Right?
There really wasn't a lot in my cursory review that I did of it in terms of parking, and there were restrictions on traffic and how many parking spaces, but in terms of actual parking and action of parking, I didn't really find anything.
So if there's no written specifications on the parking or use of the parking, they can pretty much do any retailer coming in can pretty much do anything they want unless there's some sort of limitation written in that.
Making sure that it comports with state law too. That's,
Right.
that's the big,
Okay.
that's always the big overarching concern. It's just making sure that whatever you want to do isn't preempted by the state motor vehicle. And that it wasn't outright allowed through the land use application process.
Okay, well, maybe we can jump into the nitty-gritty of what's important.
I totally agree.
Okay. And then maybe Heather can come back and let us know if it'll work. One of the things that, I noticed, and I unfortunately had not had time to do, was go through all of the prohibited parking on certain streets within our code. And one of the things I feel is really important is that the storage of vehicles, dilapidated vehicles, for sale vehicles, vehicles in disrepair, all of those things, including the oversized vehicles and RVs, are not parked along major thoroughfares or arterials where we've got folks traveling in and about Sherwood. I'm guessing that a lot of the streets that are already listed within the code include those areas. But as additional development happens within Sherwood, I think that it's really important that as folks are coming into our city that they see the best of what we have to offer. And if we can protect the feel and the character of Sherwood, I think that would be fantastic. Does anyone have any other thoughts or?
Well, can I? Sorry.
Yeah.
A little bit of a clarification here, because I know that council didn't give you much guidance on where they wanted this committee to go, but it was pretty clear to me that the scope of what I understood them to talk about was regulations or ordinance related to business regulations. So I guess if that's somewhere you want to go, I guess there would need to be some sort of finding or information that explained how that related to business related ordinance, which is kind of what the charge of this committee was. So.
Yeah, well, I think in response to that, I feel like the goal of development and growth is to encourage consumers and pedestrians and connectivity between the different areas of Sherwood. So I think that as folks are driving and walking and biking, those vehicles and all of those things that I mentioned, they can be unsightly and unsafe. And so I feel like that could not only affect Sherwood, but its guests and the folks that are going into the businesses.
I think that's a valid concern. It's important. I guess to Tom's point, I think the first thing we should tackle is the RV parking in commercial zones.
Okay.
And if we feel like it's important and we have a mandate from the council to come back and talk about street public parking and what's not in the code already, because I know there's some coverage of that already, then, I think that's fine to revisit later, but I don't want to get distracted from what we really are, the primary focus should be.
So if I can just clarify my point, and actually I should have said this, and I apologize, but my intention was within parking lot areas, for example, so that as you're driving by shopping centers or other retail facilities, restaurants, that they're not anchored by these kinds of vehicles.
And I
I thought you were talking about the roadway.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
no, I'm sorry, I was not clear.
I can understand your concern, because I live on Lincoln Street, and we do have 2 RVs parked in private properties that house people permanently.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know there's a homeless population here, and even on the site today, I saw like a little flyer coming up, because there's a homeless boy population that lives near the Langer, but I don't know if you're all aware of that. So, I mean, and because the workers aren't paid very well at Walmart, for example, there I can see where your concern might be that people can be coming in and then having RVs parked on residences that already exist
On the private property.
just to house the workers.
Oh, I see, okay. Do you have anything to add in terms of parking the vehicles and that sort of thing?
I feel as though the intent, I guess I tend to agree, if that's the right term, with Tom, in that when we start talking about, although I think that Naomi's concern or her point is valid, I think that when we start talking about RVs being parked on private streets and residences, I just feel like that's not what we're supposed to be doing here. And, you know, I think that there are quite a few other cities and states that address RVs being parked in private parking lots. But for instance, hospitals do it all the time for visiting doctors and families who have people in long-term care. They have RVs parked in parking lots. I tried to look for things that might be an issue for us. So, you know, medical facilities, hospitals, they do this quite often. And they actually have a place for them to park and stay.
Could,
Yes. So, you know, obviously that is not a retail center, but, you know, if there were a center, you know, if that were to affect commercial parking, I would think we'd need to pay attention to things like that. Most definitely, I feel like if in the application of a new development, they are not expressly asking for places to have power and hook up and plug in, that we maybe address not allowing that to happen in parking areas. And it seems like that could be a pretty straightforward way of making sure that people aren't parked long term.
well, I think if we just ban the camping outright, then why would they ever build it?
But what is camping? Then we have to define
Well,
it.
and I think some of the other ordinances up here give a pretty good, some definitions I really like.
Yeah, Gilroy does a great job of it, I think, and they have a migrant population, migrant worker population, and that's part of the reason why they have this ordinance, or this in their code. But I do think we need to, my point is, I think we need to stick with commercial property and be very clear.
I would
commercial property.
agree with Rachel on that. I think that's where neighborhood associations and CC&Rs are put into place too.
We don't live in one though. There's a whole neighborhood where I live in the poorer part of town. Like I don't see this being an issue in Woodhaven but certainly where I live on Macon Street and then going, you know, just west of there. So I mean east of there. People could, you know, I could foresee somebody opening up their street to have somebody live. I mean, because there really are two of my neighbors have full-time residents living in their RVs already.
And not to at all dismiss your concern, Naomi, but I feel like the current code does address RV parking and hours of storage of RV parking.
So we could maybe say like maybe within 2,000 feet of the development, you know, or within the town center, you know, no RV.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a possibility.
Is that something that we could do, Tom, is put a clarification of kind of like they do with schools and whatever kind of retail outlets is 1,000 feet from a retail center, there can be no RV parking on the street.
Or within a parking
Or is
lot.
that within our,
Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, and Heather might be able to chime in here too. Maybe it'll depend on a lot of things, and I think this conversation is good, and I get Naomi's tied to the business thing, so I think, that's what I was trying to impress is, there has to be a tie between what's going on with the business and stuff, and so you guys have I'm satisfied that you guys have done that with your clarification, so that's good. But I think until we know what section of code we're actually going to be changing, it might be a little bit more challenging to figure out the specifics of how we're going to do things. So probably what might be more helpful tonight is to come up with a list of those things that you want to be taking a look at, so that Heather and Brielzer and staff can go back and take a look at those code sections and figure out, okay, well, this would be here, this would be here, this would be here, and hopefully they all end up in the same section so you can clarify things within there. But we might be diving in a little bit too deep on particular items as to, because I don't know, which section the three things that have kind of come up reside in, and they might be in three different places in the code, so then we're looking at three different ordinances. So maybe the list of what you want us to take a look at, and then coming back and giving you feedback on how that could be accomplished might be.
And if it's already in your code.
Yeah.
Well, I might suggest then if we could maybe narrow that down to like specific no parking hours at a retail center. Or are we going to have any parking? Or are we going to have a maximum of 2-hour parking, 4-hour parking, and no parking between such and such hours? And that may be we could just kind of focus in on that and then go on to get like each agenda item nailed down after that.
I'll jump in. I have some suggestions, I guess, that maybe a little more specifically. So I have read several of these ordinances from other towns as well, and I kind of like a combination of things from multiple of them. I think the Beaverton one is a pretty decent starting point. The only thing I'd say is I don't care about the hours. I care about the activity. I don't want someone camping at 3 in the afternoon any more than I want them camping at 3 in the morning. So to me, that's the important part, is what the use is. And there's some of the definitions in some of these codes are pretty good. Hillsborough says live, sleep, or reside in a recreational vehicle. That's a pretty broad definition that would cover sleeping as well as cooking and camping. Other ones actually specifically talked about, I think, cooking and sleeping and those type of activities. I think if we got that kind of definition around, this is the activity we're talking about, right? You're not there. I don't care if somebody stops at a store that happens to be open. We'll get to the hours of operation in another topic, but let's say there's a store that's open at 3 in the morning and somebody pulls in and they're there for 40 minutes because they're inside the store shopping. Well, that would be in violation if we had a 30-minute limit, and that seems silly to me. They're in the store shopping. They're not camping. So to me, it's more about the activity. If they're in their vehicle sleeping or cooking or whatever, then that's camping in my definition. And then to me, it doesn't matter what the time is. If you're there for the apparent purpose of camping, as defined as sleeping, residing, cooking, whatever, then you're in violation. Doesn't matter if it's 10 minutes or 10 hours. And I think there's a combination of these codes that if you put together, kind of get to that. So the live, sleep, or reside.
That's from the Hillsborough.
But that was from Hillsborough. Point 2. Overnight parking, prohibiting commercial zones. We're talking specifically about commercial zones, but maybe we need to expand that to make sure we're covering the light industrial zone with the PUD overlay, or any retail centers. I mean, we can expand on that definition. I think we're all in agreement that we would want it to apply to all commercial properties, not regardless of the zone. Live, sleep, or reside I talked about. And then the thing I like about Beaverton is they actually had a protocol, right? The person in charge is required to make a reasonable attempt to, get the person to move along, and if they don't, then the person in charge of that particular place is in violation. Obviously, the burden, we don't want a burden to fall on, Milo's, for example, because someone's parking. It wouldn't apply because you don't have a parking lot, but let's say you did. I mean, I think that would be overly burdensome to small businesses. We'd have to have some definition of the size of the retail center in that scenario I think signs also, and a certain amount, a retail center of a certain amount of space, signs are required to be posted. This is the ordinance. You can't camp here, and here's how we define camping, and here's what the penalty is. And then the one thing that the ordinance didn't have is what happens if the person in charge can't get the person to leave or can't locate them or they don't answer the door when they're knocking on it. I mean, to me, the next step is you call, the non-emergency number of the police department and they come along and try to get the person to move along or issue a citation or whatever. And I think that we should require the person in charge of a large enough retail center to do that.
On the Van Horn, Texas code, which was funny because when I did a search, it was one of the ones that came up. They do a very good job of defining what camp means, and it does talk about 4 consecutive hours. So I get what you're saying about a time limit, but at the same time, if, for instance, you stop at a camping world and you're getting your RV repaired and you pick it up and you have kids and you want to make them lunch, you're there for 3 or 4 hours, I don't think that's who we're trying to force out of the parking lot, But this talks about 4 consecutive hours. It expressly says, sleeping, making preparations to sleep, including the laying down of bedding. And what I like about this is it doesn't only address RV. It's basically saying no camping at all. Yeah. At all. No digging, no fire making, no nothing. It also talks about a public area, which says outdoor area to which public has access and includes streets, highways, parks, parking lots, which I get may not be, it's just maybe that fine line that we're not able to cross at this point, but maybe we're laying groundwork for somebody to eventually say, we would like this to be everywhere. And it does talk about schools, hospitals, apartment houses, and it expressly discusses right-of-way to those places. I wonder, though, how difficult it would be to make some sort of, in talking about this, it seems like there could be reasons why people might want to do this and might want to allow it.
Temporary use permit.
Yes. So could there be a temporary use permit at some point?
I would guess, and Heather, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I would guess that as the ordinance was drafted, there could be exemptions written in to the ordinance for certain.
A lot of cities that have, sort of RV restrictions, they'll have a process where you can go and get, a temporary permit to be there for however long. And even like another city that I represent, they have that process, and then there was like extenuating circumstances even beyond that. They came to council, they asked, can we keep our RV here? That's in that ordinance it applied to the whole city. So, you can definitely build a process like that into whatever changes that you make, so that there are exceptions.
Yeah, and one that kind of jumps out to me is the Elks Lodge has RV. And it has had RV parking for a long period of time. So clearly they have a use up there which their members appreciate and use, where there is essentially camping going on for months at a time for their members and for other Elks members from other places. So you'd want to consider those things as you put things together. Obviously, potentially you could say, we don't like that and we want to change it. But then you get into issues of pre-existing and non-conforming uses, which is probably more in Chapter 16. But you're then taking away a right from, or not a right, but something that somebody's traditionally done.
They're changing the current situation, and that's always.
Wouldn't the Elks be exempt from that since they're not a retail business or they're a fraternal organization?
It depends on how you. Yeah. Exactly what you're talking about is what I'm trying to get at. What exceptions you're going to make, because you can apply it to the whole city.
It's still a commercial property, right?
The Elks is zoned low density residential, so I believe probably at this point in time they're a existing non-conforming use on property. So while they have a commercial use, they are not on commercial property.
Okay. So, what I've heard everyone say is we're not comfortable with folks cooking and sleeping in parking lots within any part of our commercial district, other than a few of these exemptions, like the Elks Club, where, I wonder how we could, Heather, how could we build that in? That's your job. What are your thoughts?
In terms of how,
so let me ask a question. So for us, what I've heard Tom say is, tell us what you want. You'll go back and figure out if we can do it. You'll draft the language, or if we already have it. So maybe, as opposed to talking about all the nitty-gritties of what's exempt and what's not exempt and all of those things, we can just start talking about our laundry list of wishes, and Heather can go back and do her magic.
and you know, if you look at some of the, I think it was in, you know, like in the Gilroy, the California code, you know, there is a section there that has, you know, there's a little exemption language there. It's under E. So, you know, just, you know, what type of exemption language you'd be looking at too. Like, what do you want?
Okay.
What type of exemption do you want? So that would be a provision in the code too. So.
That code, Naomi, addresses, I think, what you're talking about. The exemption, or basically it just says it can, if it's entirely on residential property, it's fine, but it can't use any hookups from that residential property, which was a little bit of where I was going with the commercial parking lot. You know, if they're a fully self-contained vehicle, that's one thing. You know, grandma's parked her RV in front of your house for 72 hours while she's visiting, not a big deal. But, you know, hooked up and plugged into the house and renting and living in, maybe a different issue. I wonder if possibly what we could do is make the list of what we feel like absolutely should not happen, and find out if we have any of those things already in our code. And then maybe once we find out what's already there, figure out what the exemptions might be, and possibly when we send the ordinance to the council, suggest that it be, you know, maybe they consider making it citywide. Does that sound like a decent proposal?
That sounds great.
I just wanted to follow up with a quick question. You had brought up the Texas ordinance, and I think their definition is great, but I'm a little concerned about the 4 hours, because the definition doesn't apply under 4 hours. So someone could pull in to a parking lot and stay for 3 hours and 45 minutes in the middle of the night sleeping, and it would technically be not in violation of code. And are we okay with that?
I'm okay with that. I think there are long-haul drive truckers. I think there are people who work very late shifts. I think I'm okay with that.
I'd be okay with that during business hours, but if the business is closed, then there shouldn't be any reason for people to be occupying that parking lot. That's my take on it. Because there's a rest area right up the freeway.
Is there?
The Baldock rest area, I-5 south of Wilsonville.
And I would tend to agree with you. I think that I understand your concern of folks resting and taking pit stops and that sort of thing. But, you know, as we're considering applying this to commercial districts, it would be really difficult to, in my opinion, provide allowances without applying it to the entire district.
Okay.
And part of that is our town is so small, right? There's only so much space to fit all the various uses in, right? Like the town I moved from was...
You know, I'm sorry, but I'm struggling with allowing the opportunity to where, you know, a Sherwood police officer is feeling like he needs to bother a man or woman sleeping in their car for an hour in the Walgreens parking lot. I mean, I just feel like that's not what we're...
while somebody in there is in there shopping. You know,
I guess I feel like that's not. I guess I feel like that's not a public nuisance or a problem, and I feel like that might not be the best use of time and resources. I guess that's where I'm coming from with it. I get what you're saying, but I also think that we're, while we are a small town, I mean, we do, you know, we have places that Sherry's is open 24 hours. I can imagine a worker there working a double shift. And I certainly don't want them browsed out of their car and told they can't. You know, I guess I'm not really willing to open that door, but I can definitely be overruled.
Well, I think Larry brings up a decent idea of having it apply to the hours of operation. Obviously, in a commercial zone, you have, like a Sherry's even, you know, there's a lot of different businesses in there, and they're open 24, and most of the other places aren't. So what part of the thing would it apply? None of the parking lot, a section of the parking lot, and then even then, I think your example is great, but what if a 30-foot RV pulls into the parking lot and sets up camp? Are we comfortable with that? You know, they sleep there for 4 hours or whatever. I'm not saying I'm not, I'm curious what the rest of you all think about that. It sounds like you are okay with it.
I think that's not the intent of what we're talking about. I think the person who pulls in their RV and sleeps for 4 hours is not the person that is causing the problem.
I thought that was the intent of what we were talking about, because Walmart specifically allows that in a lot of their locations by manager approval.
And people
I think that's what people don't like.
to the Walmart, they'll go from one Walmart to the next as they go down the coast.
I guess for me, I feel like we're now targeting a specific business.
I'm not either, and I was only bringing it up as an example that I think that is one of the reasons why it's on the list of things to talk about and important to people, because I think that they don't want to see 30 RVs sitting in any parking lot, you know, camping. I think that there's a lot of people.
I guess I have a
feel
different
about
definition
that.
of camping. I think camping is 24 hours or overnight.
Well, part of it, I think,
Well, overnight, if there's a 4-hour limit, overnight could be 1 to 5. I mean, that's really the time when I think most people don't want to see people camping, right?
with only 2 officers on duty at night, for example, it's asking them a lot, I think, to go and monitor, you know, if there's not an ordinance in place.
Well, I mean, I think that's a little bit different, because I don't think that we're suggesting that our police force is out monitoring parking lots. However, I think that enacting this kind of ordinance does provide the police an opportunity and the ability to approach folks that shouldn't be in areas that the city of Sherwood is potentially going to vote on, areas that they don't want folks parking and sleeping and cooking and those sorts of things.
And that could be for their own safety as well.
Right.
I mean, if you have a camper parked out in a big old parking lot where no one's at, I mean, they could be at risk, you know, from some ill doer. Also, I don't think anyone. I don't want to speak for you. I don't believe that people are intending for the police to patrol and proactively address these issues. I think if someone notices a problem and calls, then having an ability to take action is good. But I don't want the police out patrolling and looking for these problems on their own.
And I'm not suggesting they will be. What I'm suggesting is that there will be people calling and saying, this RV has been parked in this parking lot for 2 hours. Or this RV has been parked in this parking lot for 4 hours.
I would agree with that.
I'm concerned about that.
I would also just throw this out there that we probably should have some sort of exemption there for emergencies, because I think it's important for us as a city to not necessarily provide a place for people to camp, but if they're driving through our town and in the middle of the night and their RV breaks down, they should be able to pull somewhere for a couple hours and feel that it's safe until Les Schwab or whoever opens up in the morning.
Yeah. So it sounds like we have some sort of an idea of what the exemptions are, and we have some sort of an idea of what we don't want to allow, right? So could we at least start with the list making to see what we've got in our existing code? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So,
I think so.
it sounds like no time limit. No time. We don't want to discuss time. So it's not acceptable for any amount of time. Is that how we feel?
You know, I said that originally, but now that I've heard the rest of the discussion, I'm not sure that I agree with myself anymore, and that's good. I mean, that's why we're here, right? I think 4 hours is too long. I think 30 minutes is too short if it's, you know,
Sure.
the type we're talking about before. So I think it's partly about what the definition is, right? Are you there to shop, or are you there to reside in your camper, or whatever?
And I think that's exactly the key. Maybe I've been on too many road trips in RVs with 4 kids, but I can foresee times when you might need to stop for a certain amount of time. And I guess that probably someone is not, I'm not going to be outside barbecuing, and, you know, we're not going to sleep there. And for the most part, the general population is not going to do those things. And so I guess that's my point, is I would like to err on the side of that people are going to, for the most part, be trying to do the right thing. And when they're not trying to do the right thing, those are the people that we're trying to sort of keep out of these parking lots. So we don't want to open up Sherwood to be a home for people who don't have a home anywhere else
I would.
in the parking lot.
What do you guys think about 2 hours? Is that Like I was kind of thinking 4 hours is a little long, but I think 2 hours kind of allows for emergencies and for like a safe rest, but not enough to get comfortable for 72 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would entertain that as an option. I mean, you brought a good point. Barbecuing, outdoor cooking, making cause for food preparations, those sorts of things. I mean, making any kind of a fire within the commercial district, I think, is just a bad choice.
Putting out your awning, I mean, anything that is other than parking, to me, should clearly be covered.
So it sounds to me like you guys are really coalescing around the Van Horn, Texas definitions B in terms of camp. I'll just read the terms of camp mean to use a public area for living accommodations purposes for a period of time in excess of, they had 4, something like you might want to change that to 2 or something else. Consecutive hours for activities such as, but not limited to, the following: sleeping or making preparations to sleep, including laying down and bedding for the purpose of sleeping, parking of a motor vehicle, motor home, or trailer for the apparent purpose of overnight occupancy, storing personal belongings, making a fire, carrying on cooking activities, or doing any digging or earth breaking. I'm not sure what that means. But is that kind of the direction you guys are headed, at least for definition of camping, what you're trying to get at?
I think that portion of the definition, it sounds like we're in agreement. I would not necessarily go on to say, on the second page, it does talk about except in designated areas where the owner or agent in charge of the property gives the approval.
Yeah, no, I was only getting to the
Yeah.
definition.
Okay,
And I think
just want to clarify that.
The only thing that I crossed out on there was the 4 hours and made it 2 hours, and everything else looks like we could
Agreed.
cut and paste that.
And I agree that that's, I think, a good definition, and we can come up with the right time in 2 hours. I'm good with 2 hours as well.
There must be an RV campground around here, right? I don't have an RV, so I don't, I'm not familiar with the area enough to know. But
I am fairly familiar with the area, and again, I don't speak for the fire department, but I have a very good knowledge of our First 2 area and of the fire district. And there is an RV park on Ellenson Road, just east. There is the Elks that I don't think it's defined as a camping park per se, but members, you have to be a member to store your thing, and I actually think they do have a limit on how long you can be there.
There's one on 99 too by the river.
One on 99 by the 12th
And that floods
River
every
also.
other year, so.
You know,
Is that just up north of a mile or two? Is that the one you're talking about? So we shouldn't be presenting a pressing need in the community if there's already neighboring ways to fill that need,
I
right?
think the Elks would be the only RV overnight place in our city.
Well, but I think we need to be careful because at some point the Elks could vacate or move, and I would hate to provide that exemption in the form of an ordinance where another very different kind of user could come into or onto that property.
Well, I mean, but if we specifically say the Elks,
Can we?
can you do that?
I think you can get there without specifically labeling your neighbor. So if you want to cut out an exemption, then we'll find a way to do that.
Okay.
Because there are churches that also offer an RV space. I believe we have some in town. I believe we do have some in town that allow people to park RVs in church parking lots.
And to me, I think that comes back to who we're trying to cover by this, and I think that, to me, it's commercial, and I don't think churches are commercial, but maybe they are. Or maybe we go more specific and we say retail. I think there's different, and I guess I'd be looking for an attorney to give us some different options maybe when they come back on how we can define this to cover the areas I think we all want to cover without overstepping and hurting on some of these other areas.
I like the signage idea. I don't think we should let go of that. I think putting some onus on property owners to provide signage that says these things, and maybe even, going a step further. And I'm wondering if possibly Nancy at the Chamber might have information about where people can park RVs or where they can stay, or if we could possibly direct them to where they could be, or possibly these larger retailers could have something at the entrance or their information or customer service.
That's a great idea.
Where people might be able to go and say, hey, where can I park my RV because it says I can't in your parking lot. I'm a firm believer in giving people the tools to do the right thing, while at the same time telling them what they can't do.
I would have to say, in terms of signage, that I feel like we need to be careful with sign requirements, because I think oftentimes signs become often and much, and they can really make a community not look very good. But I think that if there's a requirement, for example, for a business to post one sign near its entrance or within its entrance, so customers have the ability to see what is allowed and not allowed on that property, that would seem reasonable to me. But signing a large area or requiring buildings to put signs all over them or within parking lots, I would not think that that's a good idea.
I only bring it up because we've just discussed a retailer that people know and understand they can park their RVs in a minute.
How would they know they can't?
So how would they know they can't? But I agree. I mean, it makes total sense.
Yeah, it's gotta be something to do.
One sign posted
At the entrance.
at the entrance, or in, easily accessible or readable, or.
How about on their website? Is that-
Well, not everybody has web access.
Yeah, sure. These large retailers.
Primarily for living in an RV.
So one suggestion would be maybe one sign at every entrance to a public right-of-way or something like that, so that because people can come in different entrances, and that way at least there would be coverage. So we could come up with something like that, if that makes sense.
Well, the other option with that is the state of Oregon already has regulations pertaining to towing vehicles. So if one of the options of addressing RV parking or storage or motorhomes or cooking, all these things is addressed, perhaps we could as the properties, any of the properties are signed, they could follow the towing sign requirements. I think it's within 10 feet of an entrance to a property, that sort of thing. Does that seem reasonable? And that way we can make maybe a 2-in-1 sign within the city of Sherwood?
Or leave it up to them to decide how they wanted to manage that. But I see where you're going with that. There probably is some language out there that kind of addresses that, so that we don't end up creating something else where people are, well, it was behind this tree, I couldn't see it. So,
Yeah.
I guess.
And I think on the signage, I think it's very important to have that be only applicable to parking lots or retail developments of a certain size. I don't think it's reasonable for some of the old town businesses that may have 3 parking spots or something to be required to that. It's not going to be an issue there anyway. So I don't know what that right definition of a square footage, like a parking lot square footage or.
Well, and I'm not sure that we would necessarily, and I'm just throwing this out there, but I'm not sure that identifying even retail use is necessary, because I think that with plans for development in the future of Sherwood, we're looking at potential industrial sites and office buildings and all kinds of other buildings.
Yeah,
So, and I would,
public parking area.
or private parking area.
And one of these I saw a definition, because I didn't like the public area because it doesn't cover private,
Right.
and private may be too broad, but one here I think I saw something like private parking accessible to the public, or something along those lines. And so maybe there's some way to split that hair a little bit. And I think you're right, covering industrial as well as commercial and retail I think is important. But I do think that the signage requirements specifically, and any other like compliance requirements, need to have a reasonable, low-end limit, so we're not overburdening, small companies and developments in town. Like to me, Obviously, the new development should be required. The Target development, the Safeway, the Albertsons, the Safari Sam's, all of those are, to me, big enough that they should be required to have this sign postage. Anything smaller than that.
But not all of those businesses are big.
Right, but there's a property management owner over each of those, right? I mean, that controls the whole property, so the burden would be on them. So it's
But for
I think
example,
Albertsons and Safeway may already have signage as far as no for sale parking. I think I've seen that out in the front of Albertsons. So, that may already be in.
I feel like limiting it to size, this one instance I feel like should apply to all business sizes, but for instance, Railroad Street, Old Town, those are all private owner buildings. My building is owned by someone, the Rainbow Markets building is owned by someone, and there is space behind my building where somebody could park an RV for a very long time on the alley. Nope.
Okay, I was trying to.
Right. I mean, no, usually I would agree. I would tend to agree with that. But there is the opportunity for any small business to be able to do that, and we have many small businesses around town with parking areas that belong to them that could.
So, as the tenant of, let's use that for an example.
Mm-hmm.
Couldn't you just call the police and say there's an abandoned vehicle or something?
What if it's me?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
What if it's the business owner? Well, it is the man who leases Rainbow Market,
Sure.
parks his RV behind Rainbow Market, US Bank parking lot. I mean,
I think our current ordinance already covered that.
that's a private That's a private area. So I would think it's the same as having it in a residence. I guess that's something you'd have to look at to see whether we already cover it.
Do some research.
Again, we sleep there overnight before cruising. Well, and I think
that falls in the exemptions or the.
I mean, we do it.
Sure.
Well, and I think that in addition to the things that we're talking about, I think that clearly we need to leave property owners with the ability to also create additional restrictions on their own property if they so choose. So while they may not be free to open up their parking lots for overnight parking and all of the things that we've discussed, I think that we should also provide them the opportunity to say, actually, no, this is our parking lot, and no, we will not allow any overnight parking.
That's a good point. I think.
Which I think is already.
I mean, by doing nothing,
Yeah.
that's essentially the case, right?
Well, I think private owners have the ability to restrict.
This would be minimum quality.
This would be a minimum requirement within incorporated Sherwood, is what I think we're talking about.
And maybe that's
Maybe
where
sure.
the size thing comes back into play, is we can say it's required for spaces over a certain size, and it's optional for places smaller, and if the owner of that particular, Old Town development wants to post a sign because they feel like, overnight parking may be a nuisance there, then they're allowed to, but we're not going to necessarily require them to, because maybe that's a burden we don't want to necessarily force on people.
Is that even an issue we need to address? The size of the business that has to comply? Yeah, I would think.
You definitely want to determine who and where is going to apply. So, that's definitely.
So, following up on that, have we given you a clear intent of who we're trying to apply this to, or do you need more?
So, we definitely. One question I did have, which is why I brought up Section 8.04, was the dilapidated vehicle part of what you all were discussing, because I'm definitely not clear on that, and whether you wanted, was that part of the camping overnight issues, or totally separate?
I was thinking of it as a separate issue personally, but I won't speak for that.
Yeah, in my opinion, I would see that as a nuisance rather, and perhaps we can incorporate that into a nuisance kind of an ordinance as opposed to in this, oversized vehicle, RV, motorhome, trailer kind of.
Yeah. I think the difference is in the camping situation, the person is most likely going to be there with the vehicle. In the dilapidated vehicle, we're talking about most likely an abandoned vehicle or in a vehicle that's at least been there a long time. I know that Oregon, the state statutes won't allow towing more than less than 72 hours. So, there's that So I would presume most likely that abandoned vehicle cases, they're not necessarily going to be there, right? If somebody's broken down on this, you know, and pulls into the parking lot and they're there trying to get back up and running to get back on the road, that's a whole different.
And you're concerned about that in the parking lot?
People who break down?
Dilapidated vehicles.
Yeah, long-term dilapidated, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what.
72 hours or more, I would think, right?
I would think a retailer would also find that a concern, though.
Yeah.
And that they would just deal with it.
Yeah, but you would hope it's not an issue that needs to be addressed.
Is it already covered under the 72 hours?
Is it already covered under the 72 hours? So, I mean, that's
Well, the state law allows towing with a 72-hour notice. It doesn't require it. So if we want to require
I see.
businesses over a certain size to take action, then I think we have to come up with some ordinance to do that.
Heather, did you happen to look at what our code is that already, you've mentioned that we have one that addresses dilapidated vehicles?
It doesn't, not dilapidated vehicles, not that exact word.
Abandoned?
That's not used.
Broken,
But,
ugly?
I need to do more research in your nuisance section, but then you also have that section 8.04, which discusses abandoned. And I believe that it only applies to those that are on city streets, so the public right-of-way right now. So that's what you currently have.
So could we add for sale vehicles to that? Is that kind of, I mean,
That's actually, based on our code, it's, the for sale vehicles, the junked vehicles, it would appear that that's listed under Chapter 10 already.
Yeah, I believe most for sale vehicles are already covered under our code. I know we've had issues with that, and they aren't allowed to stick around for very long.
I don't see any.
Oh, that's right.
That's awesome. So I have to ask this question, which is, I don't know how to ask it in a nice way, but what is the big red truck by Symposium?
So,
What is that considered?
I think that's nice.
It's unfortunately it falls under, well, there's a difference between the vehicle and the sign on the vehicle. It's really challenging, and we've looked at this a number of ways, and Jim Claus mentioned at the last meeting is, you know, you have to be time, manner, content, and place neutral in regards to signage. And they are working through a kind of a difficult area to write code or to enforce, because it's on a moving vehicle, which does move from time to time, and it's not unlike any other box delivery truck or anything else that parks in different places and has all sorts of words and signage on it. So we looked at that, and that's part of the sign code, and it was actually considered when they did the sign code updates last year, and there just wasn't really an effective way to get to the sign. Certainly the vehicle might be different if you wanted to talk about parking something on private property for a period of time, but then you're really going to be challenged because that probably happens a lot. So you can find a way to get there. Yeah, but that's a tough one. We've talked about that.
Okay.
I think going back to the 8.04 abandoned vehicle code, I think the definition to me looks fine. I think if we just extended that to private, you know, commercial zones in addition to the public, that may cover what we are trying to get at. It's basically, it says the vehicle either has expired plates or no plates, or it's inoperative or disabled, or it's wrecked, or it has not moved in 72 hours and appears to have been stored. And I think that covers what we're getting at. So I think all we need to do is expand it into the commercial retail zones, you know, probably under the same definition we were looking at before, and that might get at the heart of what we're trying to accomplish. The only thing that maybe we want to add to that is requiring certain businesses to take action, because right now they're allowed to take action, but they aren't required to, and that I'm not saying that I'm in for that, but that may be something that the committee wants to discuss.
And would we consider an exemption for a vehicle that belongs to the business? For instance, if you have a business and you have a vehicle that is part of that business, delivery vehicle, you have a delivery van and it's broken and it's in your parking lot, Does that apply to that, or is that an exemption?
I would think the company owns that van, so it would probably be exempt because it's part of the company, whether it runs or not. If you have your writing on Joe Smith Furnishings,
Sure.
or he's parked out in front of Joe Smith Furnishings in one of the parking spots, I would think that's part of your...
So it would be an exemption, in other words. Because what we're talking about now is a vehicle that's abandoned, broken, not
Or appears to have been stored.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that I feel like we should list that as an exemption. I feel like if it's a functioning vehicle and it's in use, that's reasonable.
Sure.
But in my opinion, if any vehicle is dilapidated, it could potentially provide hazard to the area.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, I agree. I think the property owner, even if they are the owner of the business and the owner of the vehicle, I mean, I think they have a responsibility to address the issue in some reasonable time frame. I mean, if their work vehicle has, the delivery van has broken down and they just decide to park it in front of their business for the next year, I don't really think that's okay.
I don't either.
I mean, but if you disagree, I really want to understand that point.
It is currently 72 hours.
Has not been used in 72 hours.
Yeah,
I would think that's adequate.
I would agree.
Well, let me clarify, the vehicle's not moved in 72 hours and appears to have stored, so,
So what's moved?
well,
We're talking about a parking lot that's thousands of square feet. Is it moved across the parking lot? Is it moved 4 spaces? What's moved? Off the property?
I think any of those would
One
fall.
space.
Right.
But
I'm just saying,
Yeah.
it's happening.
I guess I don't know the example you're talking about, so maybe that's what
It doesn't, I guess it doesn't, the exact.
Well, I only can be illustrative of what your concern is.
So if you have a large parking lot and you've got a vehicle A and parked in slot 3, and it's been there for over 72 hours and nobody's, it looks like it's been stored. And then, someone calls X and they say you need to move it, what's moved? If you say it can be moved and they move it across the parking lot and it's still in the parking lot, at what point, even if you have it towed across the parking lot, it's still been moved.
I would say,
Do we want it off of
being
the
a
property?
member of a neighborhood association with CC&Rs, we go through this all the time. We have boats and RVs and trailers, and we have a 72-hour parking limit for, visitors, and people follow the letter of the law. And after 72 hours, they'll drive around the block and then park 10 feet farther south, and
Right.
they have adhered to the letter of the law.
Well, and as a property manager, I find that happening in my parking lots often and much. So even if a car is not functional, it can still be put in neutral and moved. So I think what we're getting at is that all vehicles would be moved out of parking lots or parking spaces within the city if they're not functional and being used for their intended purpose. So off of the property is what we're asking them
Has
to
to
do.
be removed from the property.
Removed from the property
And,
for a period of
and
how
just
long?
to add to that, I don't,
Until it
we may not be able to cover every
Right.
issue on these. So, I would maybe it would be my suggestion to cover what we can for the most amount of instances and people for these businesses, and then
There's always going to be a way for people to
Yeah.
skirt the law.
I guess I'm trying to figure out what we're trying to avoid. What we're trying to avoid is a broken vehicle being in a parking lot for a year.
Yeah.
If that's what we're trying to avoid, or if we're trying to avoid something not being in a parking lot for a week, I feel like those are different issues. But it makes sense. I don't want to spend all day splitting hairs about, what moving a vehicle is. But, if you have someone who owns a small business in a development and they have a broken car and they move it, every 72 hours, we've accomplished almost nothing.
In that particular case, I think what people may be concerned about is not the small business, case where someone's going to exploit the letter of the law. I think what maybe the bigger concern is a larger development that has, it starts accumulating abandoned vehicles, and the property owner decides, I mean, I think this is rather far-fetched, but let's say the property owner decides they don't care or they don't want to deal with it, right?
So I have a question. Do you guys feel that there currently is a problem with this, and or do you feel that in the near future that there is going to be a problem with this because of something that's going on? That's a question we usually ask ourselves as we're trying to develop code. Are we trying to solve a problem that isn't, or are we satisfied that currently what's in place is actually kind of happening because people are kind of leasing their own properties? So, but
I don't think this is a problem that currently exists in, I mean, I'm not going to speak to the residential zones, because I think that's already covered in the code. I'm talking about the commercial and retail zone. And I don't believe it's a problem that's going to exist, you know, in the near future either, but I think that there are people who are concerned about that. I think if we just took the code and expanded it to cover commercial retail, then that gives the property owners something that they can use to enforce, right? If it's not covered in there, it's harder for them to actually go out and do something about an abandoned vehicle. If we actually say, you know.
Well, I think I think what Thomas is saying is private property is still nevertheless private property, and if a property owner identifies a vehicle's been parked, stolen, left in their parking lot, they have the ability to tow already. So, I mean, I think that we don't, I'm not sure that that's an issue that we need to tackle.
One issue that you did bring up was cars that were leaking oil. I think that's where this kind of started from in the conversation the other day. So you guys haven't talked about that. Is that something you're still concerned about? Is that something you want to get at? And is that a dilapidated vehicle, or is that some section of our environmental code, which we don't have much of? So.
I feel like that's environmental code, because I tend to agree. I don't think any business is going to be willing to give up a very valuable parking space for someone's broken vehicle. And it's not happening. I get that people have expressed that, but I think I would prefer for someone to say, this is actually happening here, and we know that it's going to happen in the future, or we're concerned about it. You know, I feel like it's something that can be addressed. But the environmental issues, I think, are another way to address what could be a possible concern. And I think the purpose of this committee is to address the concerns that people had written on their letters to the city. So I don't know if you've all had a chance to read them.
Yeah, I actually went into City Hall on Thursday and read through them all and actually took some tallies of the categories of things that people were concerned about. So.
Maybe we can talk about that in a little bit too, because I think that's what we need to focus on.
So how,
I haven't heard that.
So after looking at that, how does that apply to the dilapidated vehicle?
Complaint was relatively non-existent in the ones that I looked through.
I thought the same thing.
Okay. Well, for the purpose of our meeting tonight and to stick to the agenda, I'm hoping that we've given you enough to work off of for RV parking and storage. We didn't include a discussion of boats, but I think oversized vehicles, do you need us to define what those are, or do you feel like, based on some of the examples that you've given us, Heather, you let us know if you need for us to be more specific.
No, I think that's fine.
So the motorhomes, the trailers, the RVs, that sort of thing.
The RV restrictions also apply to boats.
Well, I think if you go back to the Texas code, it doesn't even talk about RVs. I mean, it could be a car. I mean, it's more about what you're doing, right? You're camping, you're storing personal belongings, you're making a fire, you're cooking, taking earth. And so it doesn't, whether you have a boat or not, what isn't the relevant part. It's what you're doing with the boat or the RV or the car or the truck or the van or whatever.
Okay.
But you also want to avoid somebody like, unhitching and leaving it.
Thank you for reminding me. I was going to say, can we specifically say you may not unhitch your pulled vehicle? Are we able to say that?
Is that a problem? That, back to Tom's point, is that?
More, I think the better thing would just be to regulate, if there is, if you have the boats there, which hopefully, I hope that hasn't been a huge problem.
If you say recreational vehicle, won't that apply to whether it's hitched or not? It's a recreational vehicle or a car or vehicle or anything. So,
or you could just say vehicle.
Yes. I think we're back to splitting hairs there.
Yeah, I would agree. Do you feel like we're at a point that we can close the discussion on RVs? Yes?
Yes, ma'am.
I don't think we do it. We're not voting on anything tonight, so it sounds like Heather will come back to us with maybe some proposed language, and at the time that she does, we can decide if we'd like to have further discussion or vote. Let's take a 5-minute break. All right, let's reconvene and move on to item number 8. Which pertains to some sample ordinances related to the use and storage of pesticides and other chemicals. Heather, can you talk a little bit about what you found and get us started?
My main question here tonight for you all is like what exactly and which chemicals and pesticides or hazardous materials are you looking to regulate? So that's like my main overarching concern. So what we did, and I'm not entirely sure what exactly you wanted to regulate, sort of gave you a panoply of different kinds of ordinances to look at.
I think what came up at our meeting on Wednesday was the example of the bee issue in Wilsonville. And so I think that as that issue was raised, we started thinking a little bit about what can we do within our city that is perhaps more appropriate for our goals in terms of landscape and just general city safety. I happened upon a policy adapted by the city of Ashland that I've read over briefly, and I really like. The policy, I'll just read a little bit of it, but it was designed to reduce the risk of illness or injury resulting from city employee and citizen exposure to pesticides used in the course of performing operations, and also from the accidental exposure of employees and other persons to pesticides. And then it goes on to talk about different kinds of pesticides and how, when practical, those are used and in what instances they may be used. And I think, and I'm only trying to paraphrase what I heard at our last meeting, but that was the concern, is safety and general exposure.
So really limiting yourself to like pesticides and maybe like harmful chemicals, but not going full hog and looking into, you know, the hazardous material that's defined under state law. So it's very sort of narrow. That
it is in close proximity to the Tualatin National Wildlife Refuge, and it's in the watershed. So something to consider would be how that will.
And I noticed that did you provide us with Eugene's? It was the same one that I found, and they literally talk about any hazardous waste. They're
very
super broad.
And their ordinance is more aimed at, it's more of like, they want to be able to take immediate action when something happens. Because the DEQ, the Department of Environmental Quality process can be a little bit longer. You know, it's a bureaucracy. And I think they wanted to create a system where they could go in and, you know, take immediate action, which I didn't look at Sherwood's code in depth, but there's probably some general language that would, you know, possibly give the city the authority to do that in these, you know, hazardous waste situations. But that's a lot of what was behind the Eugene ordinance.
Right. And I felt like where I was coming from when I brought it up was more along the lines of the Eugene ordinance and being able to react quickly. The city itself, you know, after using the bee incident afterwards, I had a friend who said, "Hey, Rachel, do you know why the trees are wrapped at the Sherwood Target?" I said, "I know exactly why the trees are wrapped at the Sherwood Target." And, you know, when that sort of thing happens, there were no signs. You know, if you went in the Target and asked the employees why they were wrapped, they didn't have to tell you. And I felt like there, you know, like you said, if you know, the answer is go, you know, talk to the DEQ, or, you know, there were state ways to go about it, but there were nothing within the city that said, hey, you know, we need some signage, we need someone to address this, we need to understand that, you know, something unsafe has been used. And so that's where I was going with it, was that, you know, that somebody be able to take action, somebody meaning, you know, the city, be able to take action quickly. I'm not so clear about how to handle prevention, frankly. I'm not clear at all about, you know, landscaping uses and how we manage. I know we have lots of landscaping companies. You know, I know, you know, some of the pesticides, or I'm sorry, some of the, some larger restaurants use companies that don't use green, safe, you know, pest control. I know we do. But, you know, so I just am not clear about how to prevent. But I am very, I feel very strongly that we need to have something that addresses if exposure does happen, how and who is notified and what is done to take care of it.
Tom, can you maybe talk a little bit about whether or not the city of Sherwood currently has any kind of a maintenance specification in place for our commercial districts in terms of parking lot cleaning and exterior maintenance as it pertains to the use of chemicals and that sort of thing?
No.
Okay. So I think that's where we're going as well, is perhaps adopting a policy or a way of improving the standards that we have within the city for maintaining properties in the public that the public has access to.
And one thing I'll say, and it's just the same line, that it's the same type of process that we used with the parking procedures. But it would be a matter of like coming up with some of these ideas and then making sure that they're not preempted by state, or we also have federal law in this area. And so
You also have fire codes.
just coming up with what exactly you want to regulate and then your goal, and then, you know, we'll come back and basically say, well, these substances, you know, these regulations are going to apply. And Eugene did a good job of incorporating state and federal law, so it would be a good model if you want to look at that. But it's just
I was going to ask you specifically if you'd looked at any preemption issues already in state law. It doesn't sound like maybe you had. I think that this is an area we have to be concerned about not trying to take on too big of a task. I mean, there's a lot of federal law involved. There's a lot of state law involved. I think the Eugene is a great model. I mean, it's really talking about response to incidents and what, so they can come in, they can take immediate action, and they can fill the offending party. And I think that is a good scope. Do we want to expand that to try to get involved in regulating what's allowed, what's not allowed, how things are supposed to be stored? I mean, I'm concerned about trying to take on maybe way too big of a task that's maybe and probably at least covered to some extent by existing state and federal regulation.
I would agree. I know the fire code provides for storage of indoor, outdoor hazardous materials, and it's broken down as to, you know, how hazardous they are. And it may be under the realm of DEQ, and I don't necessarily think that we need an ordinance to, I would think, I can't think of any other instance in the past, near past or present that has happened besides this B thing that would warrant us to make a city ordinance for it. I can't think of any other issues, and I'm maybe looking for help here if you guys have heard of anything other than this Target issue
I don't know.
in the past.
I've never seen I've lived in a lot of places. I've never seen so much pesticide application as here, which I'm really surprised about, because part of Oregon is being very environmentally friendly, and I mean, you know, you see it every time I'm driving. I see somebody with a bottle up there squirting herbicide or pesticide. So I think it's pretty common. So
Are you talking about
That's a
private
good
property owners or business?
maintenance,
Or?
lawn crews, you know, private property owners. Just it's really pervasive here.
So
I think it's a
how?
problem.
So what do you propose that we should do about it?
Something like this.
Like,
Like the Eugene Code, where you at least you're notified, you know, if there is application. Like, I remember when I lived in Brookline, Mass, there was always a sign, a little flag that people had to post on their private property if they had applied pesticides, so that if children or dogs or people go on the property here,
so if someone's in their yard and they have a weed and they go spray Roundup on it, they have to put a flag up?
I think, I don't know, that's what we could discuss. If it's a big retailer, they've just done a mass, spraying, we should know about it.
Yeah, and I think that those are two very different things to me.
Yeah.
And I think that this Boulder, Colorado one talks a lot about, and I've only skimmed it while we're sitting here talking, but it seems to discuss notification of use ahead of time. And I think, in a commercial setting, or that makes sense to me. I can see going there, requiring private property owners to do that, on their house, I think is going too far. And I think the clean code is great on a cleanup side.
Well, and just to make sure that we're focused on how this is affecting business, I think that's a very valid point.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The Eugene Code does say hazardous substance duty to report, which is sort of along the lines where I was going with it was. If you are going to spray powder, whatever, that you have a duty to report that that's happening. And it's pretty common, actually, for cities and counties, primarily in places where there are lots of, I will admit, in lots of places where there are organic labelings, but also in dense populations and populations that are putting in new developments where there are large amounts of housing developments. I found quite a few. Some in the Arizona area. Regardless, the Eugene Code is really big, and it is talking a lot about private homes. So I do feel like we'd have to address commercial property. But where I was looking was what Heather was talking about, was that we have something in place that allows the city to react more quickly than DEQ, and where they can, a city can say, you're absolutely doing business in an unsafe manner in the city, and we will not allow it. And we have an ordinance that says we don't have to. And there isn't anything in place that I could find that says that. So, for me, the only way I know how to apply it is for myself, in that we have weeds that grow in the back of our buildings, and we have a neighbor who hates it, and it is along the alley. But because we are food service, and because I try to maintain a safe and green environment, we don't allow our landscaper to spray Roundup or other type chemicals. So we try to, and there are other things you can do. We cut them down, all of those things. But that's my point, is that what if I did? And
you can spray.
There are lots of things you can do. And there are lots of, we have, like I said, we have a pesticide company. He comes and he sprays stuff out of a bottle, but it's perfectly safe.
Yeah.
So, that being said, I don't want to have assumptions being made, and I don't think that, he should put up a big sign that says I'm spraying something safe, but I do think that businesses should have an obligation to report something that is unsafe and considered a hazardous material under Oregon law. And so we're not trying to recreate a wheel. We're not trying to make things be an unsafe substance that aren't already recognized by the state. They already have a great list. Oregon does a fantastic job of saying what those things are. And Eugene literally does that. They just say things defined under the Oregon state law. So I feel like there just needs to be a safety net, especially if we're looking at adding more large retailers. And while I get that you said that there is nothing besides the Target B thing, but had a bunch of bees not dropped dead in another city, would we haven't had any idea? It's one of those things that I feel like if it can be prevented, or we can be, if signs could have been put up that said, hey, you've been exposed to X.
Well, let me ask you this. Could this ordinance be as simple as allowing the city to step in immediately if some sort of spill should occur? Bam, done.
Yeah, and Eugene always visits the city manager, by the way, Tom, so I expect you to show up. at all of these places.
The city manager is defined in other parts of the code as the city manager or his designee, so that's usually how.
Anyway, it literally is. I mean, I feel like if we wanted to literally copy and paste some of the Eugene code, possibly we should just look at doing that.
Shall we go through it?
It's really long.
Well, I mean, yeah. So I think, I mean, starting on the first page under release, I think this is sensible. Spilling, leaking, pumping, pouring, emitting, emptying, discharging. And I think so long as this is, and it is, crafted in such a way to protect the public's health, I think that this is very sensible for the city of Sherwood.
It's also really old. Do you see the date on it?
Well,
My point is, I mean, people have been doing, I mean, it's a long time coming, I think, for us to get this side.
I have a quick question. There was the Superfund site on Murdoch, correct? You know about the tannery.
oh, yeah.
So, and also where they're developing on Southwest Oregon Street right now. That's also part of the tannery. So they're already, and I think maybe it's a brownfield now. I don't know if it's been entirely cleaned up. Do you know?
It's not a Superfund site. They looked at trying to get Superfund designation for that, but it is brownfield. There is still portions that have been cleaned up, at least to the point where they've gotten no further action, where the building was and then are in private hands, and they have no further action. But if they do certain things on the site, there'll be additional cleanup measures they have to do if they get below the area that they cleaned up, because they only cleaned up a cap area. The rest of the remainder of the site was basically orphaned. And it just has been slowly transferring into the hands of Washington County, and it still requires cleanup. There hasn't been any cleanup done on it. It's nothing that's too worrisome at this point, just because it's not traveling anywhere and it's on site, but it is something that has to be dealt with.
Because my question was there a code or something to set in place after having that huge problem that we can rely on and use in what we're trying to discuss here? Like spillage or...
Well, certainly DEQ is heavily involved in the cleanup efforts, but as far as is there any codes that are in place that prevent that type of activity occurring again and causing, spills on the site? Certainly the federal laws are much more strict. The city laws that we have in regards to that are very specific and probably were written such that a tannery, if it wanted to come back in, could probably, do that. So I don't know that we have really a very good city code in regards to that, but I will say that the federal regulations have certainly improved radically since the tannery was here and in business.
Okay.
So, what I hear us saying is that we would like to work on a local ordinance that would work toward providing city staff to react to spills and those kinds of things. It sounds like the Eugene Code is something that we are leaning toward mimicking. Am I hearing that correctly, everyone? Yeah?
Agreed.
Okay. All right, great. So, Heather, are there specific areas that you need for us to discuss so that you can move forward with drafting some language for our review?
I guess if in looking through it, if there are, areas that you don't feel, you want to regulate or you don't want to include in it. But if it's what you're looking for, we can leave it substantially the same and just go back and I'll just need to check federal and state law just to make sure it still comports with that, and then update all of, make sure that the references are right. But it might be a matter of, when it comes back before you, you've had a chance to really look at it in more detail. You just got it today.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you might, you can still strike provisions at that point if there's things that don't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, because we did just receive it tonight, it almost feels like we should take some time to study a little bit as you're drafting some language that would be more specific to Sherwood. I'd like to make sure that within the language that something along the lines of some kind of language that would lend itself to, when practical, using the safest, lowest toxicity levels of chemicals that are used. Something along those lines, I think, would be really helpful.
I was gonna say it's reactive. The Eugene Code, I feel like the Eugene Code, that's what I was getting at with, right? I don't know what we do for prevention, and I'm not sure that we can necessarily regulate those things, because then we're talking about regulating people's professions, which is not something we can necessarily do. But
Well, and my concern with what you just suggested, Mirta, about the lowest, possible impact, and I think that's an ideal goal, and I think we should all individually strive for that. My concern there would be, if you put that in code, then how does reporting and enforcement going to look like for the city, right? That could be a potential cost factor, long term, as well as a burden on employment or employers, right? I got to come into Sherwood, and now I have all this extra record keeping and reporting requirements that I don't have in Tigard or Tualatin or Wilsonville, and that's a concern for me.
It could have, on the other hand, it could also have a positive effect, because if there are carcinogens or, things like that that are going into our environment and we don't have any record of it, so we're not being notified, and we're having health, effects because of those, we're paying for it, but we're not aware of it. I don't know, I don't see anything in here about notification.
But it basically puts the onus on the person who's using them to report.
But on like we had in Boston, I just remember these little flags,
in the Boulder, Colorado code, it does have this sign. And I was kind of
putting those here.
Yeah, I haven't either. But so we could possibly look at something like that. Pesticides have been applied here, and then you're talking about a large retailer. I feel like at that point, or a large amount of spraying.
Yeah, there are some limitations on that. Individual spraying of weeds if the spraying distance is less than 3 feet. I'm not sure what that means, but that might be.
In a handheld sprayer.
Yeah,
I'm assuming
spraying close, that might not be of an exemption. Spot treatment of areas that are less than a total area of 100 square feet, a lot. That's a pretty good exemption there. But certainly, I think this Boulder, Colorado one applies citywide. I don't think it's. I think it even applies to private property.
Yeah, I think Eugene does also, and that's not our intention.
Well, I think, but with the exemptions you talked about, then I don't necessarily see if there's a 100 square foot total area exemption, is that 100 square foot of spraying or 100 square foot area when you spray 10 square feet of material?
So that's a lot. So
yes, it's not treatment of areas that are less than a total area of 100 square feet on a lot. So I mean, there's it's
unless you're tilling your entire lawn, I mean, you're not going to hit that threshold. And if you're tilling your entire lawn, maybe we should maybe you should post a sign.
I think that areas are it's where pets or children or people might want to sit, on grass or those types of areas, or if it's going into a 12 inch.
I have a lot of pets who sit on my lawn, but I don't feel like I'm responsible for them, or maybe if they're sitting on my private property.
Well, I know that's all our earth, we want to take care of it the best for everyone.
Absolutely, but
I think in the spirit of moving forward with drafting language, I think the goal here is to enhance safety and public health and encourage those things within the city. Is that fair? And so to that end, being proactive and creating some parameters for usage and creating some parameters for reacting to situations is where I would like to see the language go.
I think it's also important to include language that I saw in the Eugene Code, I thought, but didn't see in the Boulder, which was employee safety, which I know you know, the MSDS sheets, even I have to keep those. I mean, small as I am, I have to have those. You know, I think you mentioned that before, Meredith, the MSDS sheets.
Yeah.
I mean, we all have to have those, we all meaning businesses. But I do feel like, you know, when discussing the living wage issues in these, in some of these, that might be something that we could address in a different area, meaning this one, the pesticides area, and that, you know, we are also looking out for the safety of their employees, who are probably exposed to it way more than anybody who's visiting just the parking lot.
Is there something we need to do above and beyond what's already required by either federal or state statute in that area, do you believe?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
I mean, I have the chemicals. I mean, I'm a tiny little restaurant, and I have caustic, you know, when the guys come and clean the hood every 6 months.
But you talked specifically about employees.
Right, I don't have to tell my
You don't
employees
have to
that
tell your
that's
employees,
I don't have to keep them out of the space.
but you do anyway.
Of course I
as a
do.
responsible business
Of course I
owner.
do. But my point is, at least, let me just put it this way, that maybe I do, but I don't know that, and no one's ever told me I did, and when they come in to do the work, they don't tell me that I need to tell my employees. Does that make sense? So I don't have a way of informing, you know, it's not sort of built into the logistics of doing business within the city.
Right.
So if it were built into the logistics of doing business within the city, where they say, hey, there's a hazardous, I mean, those men come in suits, hazmat suits, you know, but I don't have to tell anybody. So possibly if something said, hey, Rachel, if someone comes in and uses hazardous materials, you must inform your employees. Then my employees have some repercussions if they get sick, other than calling DEQ or OSHA.
Yeah, and I guess my only concern there would be going back to what is the reporting and enforcement burden on the city at that, well, reporting burden and record-keeping burden on employers and enforcement burden on the city.
I guess I feel like risk is worth the reward in that case.
Yeah,
That's my
I
own
think it's
side.
something we need to consider. I'm not saying that's a reason not to do it. It's,
Sure.
it's
I also think there's not a ton of businesses within the city limits that, unless we let a tannery back in. That, you know what I'm saying? I mean, I guess I feel like the city in and of itself is not, you know, going to be.
Well, we have that
We have a lot of
area
restaurants.
coming in. I mean, so that could be something down the road that, and maybe that.
I would be more, I mean, I inform the city when our grease traps are cleaned, or the company that does them does. So even if we, you know, said, if that's being done, just inform, let them know it's happening. Just let the city know. I mean, that could be as simple as shooting an email to someone at the city that says, hey, this is happening at my business.
So am I hearing that you all would like something like the Boulder, like a separate ordinance, like the Boulder ordinance, to basically just regulate pesticides and then hazardous substances, or you want it to you want them to both be combined together somehow?
What I feel, I think there's strong agreement on across the committee is reactionary measures, right? We have a mechanism to react to incidents that occur, and I think we all agree on some level of notification requirements prior to use. I think that the scale is in debate, but something. What I think people want more information on, and I think there's not necessarily agreement on yet, but more information about would be some of these extra reporting and record-keeping requirements about hazardous materials. Am I capturing the sense of what we're all talking about?
I think so. I think partially. I think additionally, I think we're talking about imposing some guidelines on users of hazardous materials as more of a blanket philosophy for addressing different kinds of issues within the city, whether that be cleaning parking lots, whether that be spraying trees, whether that be actively leaking liquids out of buildings or what have you. There has to. I feel like what we're talking about is creating parameters that will encourage safety.
Are you talking about recommendations or requirements?
I would say that I would like to see our city have some requirements in place for folks that are using potentially hazardous materials.
In public areas?
In public
In
areas.
public areas. And that would apply to the city too,
Mhm.
as well as
Oh,
the
sure.
parks. And
That's fantastic.
I mean, I feel like, I mean, there are already regulations in place for the state of Oregon.
We can switch from that. I know there's
Yeah.
something like there's Mike Lackman's probably over biting his tongue because he knows exactly what the requirements are for sweeping parking lots, and I know there's some out there. I just don't know what they are, so that's why I said no earlier. So I think, and Heather, you know this better than I do, but I think we're really talking about two different subjects here. Hazardous materials have a certain definition, which is quite different than pesticides. And I think from kind of hearing the conversation that you're talking about hazardous materials and wanting a good code related to that. But you know, that can be nuclear material, that can be all sorts of stuff that has a legal definition that's probably not defined by the city, it's defined by state law. Where pesticide use is probably something more specific to something that could be done for Sherwood and doesn't have overlapping things going on that would probably, you're talking about, you know, noticing requirements potentially and some other things. So I don't know that there's a way to tie these two together. That's kind of what I'm saying. These are probably two separate subjects, and so I think I got the hazardous material part. Do you understand that?
Well, I mean, that's kind of what I was getting at. Okay. Really, you wanted the same types of things. You wanted to regulate the pesticide use, but you also wanted to have this more public safety, you know, hazardous substance being able to react quicker. So it would be, I would envision it as two, I mean, they could potentially be combined to be like one, you know, area in the code, but the pesticide would be called out
its own issue
as its own, you know, separate regulations and requirements for that. That would be how I would envision it, but I don't, that's why I want to know if that's how you all are envisioning it.
Where would these be regulated? Just in business retail areas or within the city limits? All buildings within the city limits?
All areas maybe open to the public.
And I think herbicides are as important as pesticides because a lot of times it's the herbicides that are being applied to, you know, get rid of the weeds or on the mulched areas, and that's a big problem.
So to answer your question, Tom, I think what we're saying is yes. Perhaps we
One
could
thing I
like
will
look at
do is I'm going to talk to Eugene, and I just want to find out, you know, how the enforcement of that has gone, how this, I mean, it's been in place for a little while. It's just to see, you know, if they have some problems with it, or there are certain sections that look good on paper, but in reality aren't really working that well. I will definitely do that, you know, when I come back to you. So there might be certain parts of it that I'll, you know, put a caution flag on. Or
could you find out who enforces that and what the cost is to the city?
You know, was it a significant cost to them when they first instituted it, or were they still primarily just relying on the state government? It was maybe it was more of the city, like, you know, to get something in quicker. Or, you know, I just want to find out in reality how does this work in Eugene. So I will and try to incorporate some of that into whatever the first process is.
Yeah, and sometimes what we find when we do legislation is rather than drafting something that has, you know, penalties and all these provisions, you know, from day one, it's kind of a progressive thing. So, you know, if you're doing, for example, for pesticides and herbicides or whatever you decide, you're having this noticing requirement, and so now all of a sudden people are starting to notice, and people are starting to notice the notices, and then it becomes, well, is there an issue here or not, you know, that we need to deal with further, and so you can always amend the code, and if it becomes, you know, an issue, people will come back and say, hey, you know what, we've noticed that people aren't abiding by this, or they're playing games with this, or we need to do something else. And so some of these things can be progressive too. So maybe this step is to do notification rather than, you know, have specific penalties and everything else, and be spending a bunch of time regulating and setting things, or maybe want to go there to begin with. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out as a thought.
I would suspect, based on a conversation that we've had, that our intention would be to assure that the onus of responsibility would be placed back on the property owner and not on the city of Sherwood. while there might be an immediate financial impact on the city in terms of response and mitigation efforts, it would seem to me that I don't hear that there's any question amongst the committee that the onus of the ultimate onus of responsibility would fall back on the person who acted in a way that resulted in a release of a substance.
Yeah, I guess my idea with it was not so much in let's find people, but I agree with what Tom is saying that, you know, even if you think of it from a simple business marketing standpoint, do you really want to, every time you show up at a place of business, have to put up signs that say you're doing something dangerous to the environment? I mean, sooner or later, people are going to start to say, this guy, every time this person shows up, this woman or man shows up, they put these signs up that, you know, have women and children in danger. You know, I do think that there comes a point where a certain amount of, you know, personal responsibility and, you know, civic responsibility might actually come into play before we have to start throwing down fines and showing up with, you know, tickets.
And I think that's a great point. And I think that that's what we're getting at with implementing these kinds of ordinances is so that the businesses can maintain their good name and that the public will want to come into our city and will want to patronize existing businesses and new businesses. And
I think it's important that you know, I do believe that it's important that Sherwood not be seen as a town where it's difficult to do business, but in a town where it's easy to do good business. I think that's what we're trying to accomplish here, and I think this can go really wrong quickly if we start throwing down signs and people getting in trouble.
Well, something just occurred to me that's rather funny. If we require notification signs, as you discussed, and people around town start seeing these signs go up all the time because of, you know, various things, we can be doing the exact same thing the next town over is doing, and they don't have any notification requirements. It gives the public perception that, oh my gosh, what are they doing there in Sherwood? There's all kinds of chemical use all the time. I want to stay away from there. It could have the actual, you know, opposite effect in the public, because the public doesn't.
It could, but it could be a great relief, you know, to pet owners or to anybody.
Yeah, I think, right. I think done appropriately. What we're talking about, we're not saying that when you walk into this space, you've been exposed to X. What we're saying is this business uses. That's where I'm going with it. Was this business has applied X? And I think it's very important that the person who has applied it be identified. The person, the company, the corporation, the entity be identified as the person who has applied the chemical. That's where I'm going with that. You know, because that then is where, you know, I mean, if you have that company in Beaverton, then you can make the connection yourself. And I think consumers are fairly smart people.
They are, and also if there's like meth, pesticide, herbicide, or insecticide application, like we lived in areas where there are really bad mosquito problems, so they would go with a helicopter and fill the city, and they would spray over ponds, and it was really upsetting to a lot of people, but the city website would say what was happening. So I don't know if we could I mean, this would be like probably more in the future, but if you can have businesses report to the city, like a quick email, and then that pops up on the city's website that day saying, well, today this is going to be happening, so, you know, people that have asthma or breathing problems or who don't want to be exposed could not go to those areas too.
You know, I kind of combine a couple of Rachel's ideas because this has been very successful in other code areas where we've done things, and that is incentivizing, you know, things. So, you know, you talked about, well, maybe there's a certain threshold, you know, for a type of chemicals to try and encourage people to use less, you know, toxic or whatever type of things. I have no idea if there's a way to do that. But, you know, for example, drugs have different classifications, you know, and I know that, you know, each type of pesticide has, you know, a half-life or something. If there would be a way that you could maybe tie an exception to something related to that, so that basically you don't need to notice if you use a chemical that doesn't, you know, do X or Y or whatever. I don't know if there's a way to get there, but then you could, that would incentivize people to say, you know, I don't really want to put these signs up. Maybe I should consider changing the way that I actually do things. So that's just
That's perfect.
And preferably if there was some reference list, you know, so instead of having to update the code with all,
something like that's on the MSCS list or something.
I would think there'd be a list of green pesticides, herbicides that are approved by,
There's a lot of sustainability
and we could
sites
just
out
go
there
from
and
something like that.
so you might be able to.
I think that's, I mean, even so much as, it's interesting because we've discussed it at our restaurant and with other business owners, we compost. You know, just even having a sign on our door that says, hey, we compost. And I mean, it's the same, it's along the same lines.
Well, and that's the other thing I was going to suggest is a lot of municipalities and a lot of other cities within Oregon do exactly what Tom has just discussed, and that is whether, and as silly as it may sound, but maybe the sign for or the symbol for Sherwood businesses that are using these kinds of products or implementing these kinds of cleaning measures, they get a green star on their window, and our residents and guests can identify very quickly that, oh, this is a business that does X, Y, Z. And so and I'm being a little bit facetious with a green star, but, you know, something that's very quickly identifiable, that really encourages good business practices.
and I'm a lot more comfortable with that incentivized type approach or recognition type approach than I am with like draconian hard and fast requirements. You know, so now you're convincing me with this new
I would
the new
tend to
approach.
Yeah, I was kind of on the other side of the fence there, thinking we were trying to put too much of our power into one place, but I would certainly agree, encouragement.
Can that be encouraged at the city level, do you foresee?
Yeah, clearly I would hazard to say that we use as much or more pesticides than anybody as a user, just because we have so much right of way to maintain and so much landscaping and parks and everything. We have to be. I don't know what our practices are, although I know that they definitely try to do that. But it wouldn't be a bad thing for the city to look at its policies and stuff too as we do things. So
I still don't think that we should do
For the incentive program.
Right.
Like maybe the city could initiate that, or do you think it would be more of a private?
Well, I think we might do it on the private, side. Let's try that first. And maybe have a green, yellow, and red,
Our school,
depending on what you can find. I don't know.
the school that, my kids homeschool, so I'm not sure which, the school was the #1 LEED certified building in the country, right? So that, if that were on the city website, people would, maybe you might not want this, but people would move here just because it's perceived to be a green city, and that's really amazing.
Yeah, and sustainability is important. It's something that Sherwood hasn't embraced as much as other cities have. But I know it's something we need to be focusing on and making sure that
That's a great cash source. It's a great revenue source, being green, right, in this area especially.
I still don't want to give up on the fact that I think people should let people know when they are using a hazardous substance in public areas.
Yeah, I think we've all agreed
Okay.
on something like
I just want to make sure we're not throwing away one for the other.
Yeah, no.
No.
Because, business owners could say, I'm just not participating in that, and then do whatever they
we're trying to combine both.
Got it.
Yeah, for sure. And in addition, to be clear, when there is a hazardous release or spill, I think that there should be some kind of notice of that as well. Once it's been clearly identified. And I know with the bee situation at Target, I think, based on what I read of the DEQs, they needed to do some testing to understand what the problem was before they could identify that to the public very clearly. And so, I think that that's reasonable. I think that we do need to allow appropriate parties to clearly identify materials used, because as you mentioned, just because someone's got a bucket full of something, you're not quite sure what's in there. So I think we need to be very careful to give folks an opportunity to identify what they've used and what they have not used.
And that's a good point, because something wrong happened there. Typically people get things that are concentrated, and I don't know if
Right.
we mixed it wrong or whatever, but that wasn't a normal.
It wasn't intentional.
Well, and in that
No,
instance,
it's just somebody
No.
did something.
and in that instance, I was more to the point of, yes, DEQ did need to find out what it was, but Target had already reacted here in Sherwood and didn't have to tell anyone what they were possibly reacting to. That was my concern, you know, that when you are wrapping trees because you think there may have been, and I get that we don't want to be, hey, I may have done something and everyone gets scared. At the same time, if a large corporation is spending money to react to something, I think that they need to tell us what they're reacting to.
I see what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah, the release or potential release has occurred.
Yes.
Okay. Heather, do you feel like you have enough direction or?
I do. My one question would be, so I know that you like some of the provisions in the pesticide ordinance, but maybe not so much the notice, the signage requirements. Like
Maybe we should look at the classifications for the notice. Does that sound like a good compromise? If we have to put a notice if they're using a certain classification, and
Well, I mean, perhaps a point of compromise, if we can have a compromise. Perhaps once we can identify what a commercial property is within the city of Sherwood, we can hone in on what kind of a notice that commercial property will be required to provide. Typically, I mean, there's schedules. You know, there's a quarterly or a monthly maintenance type schedule that takes place on any property. And so I feel like if we can provide clear, reasonable parameters, I think that might be a fair way of approaching this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you know, maybe there's going to be one list of things that requires notification and another list of things that doesn't. I'm not sure that everything we're trying to cover in both the pesticide, herbicide, and the hazardous materials waste should necessarily require notification. I'm not sure what that differentiator looks like yet, but I'm thinking maybe there is one when we get further down the path.
sure.
I would agree, and there's probably different levels of, you know, hazardous materials that are a little bigger.
We need to notify people. Well, there's a lot of resources out there. I know Beaverton has a whole sustainability department. The state has some people that have looked into this stuff, and so rather than Heather doing that, I think city staff might take that on, because I think we have some better resources to maybe take a look at how could you classify things, so when we bring that back, we can give you some potential options to think about how you might want to address those, and if there's a way to get at it in the first place. But there are a lot of people that really know this stuff well, and I know some contacts I can get in touch with that can probably advise us on how we might be able to get to that point.
And perhaps another way of looking at this is, as opposed to the city or others getting notices at various times of the month or various times of the year, I mean, perhaps an option, and I'm just throwing this out there, is that we can include a schedule that permits this kind of application, you know, for a variety of different things. I mean, and I think that many landscape companies follow schedules on when it's best to prune their trees. Perhaps City of Sherwood can identify with other professionals when it might be best to apply these kinds of substances. And I don't know. I'm hoping that maybe you can find out.
I was thinking we were talking more on the lines of a physical notice, you know, on site, you know, either prior, during, or after, or all three of, you know, a chemical use, a spray, and not some sort of like reporting through the city, having the city disseminate the information. Those, right.
Well, I guess my reason for my comment was, if the city if we have within our ordinance, let's just say, for example, during the month of October, businesses within the city of Sherwood may be using this, or during these first 2 weeks of the month, or what have you. I mean, again, I'm not trying to create parameters. There's like something in the Gazette, for example.
Yeah, I think what you're trying to get at
I don't
is
know.
best practices.
It's just best practice.
Yeah, you know, what are the best practices in regards to doing this? That's hard to regulate in an ordinance, but it's something that can be done lots of times through policy. So let's kind of see how this rolls out and figures, because the problem is if you put it in an ordinance, you know, is that ordinance is there, it'll be there 90 years from now, maybe. Maybe not that long, but 40 years from now, and those best practices get out of date really fast.
Yeah.
So we'll have to think about that.
I feel like we've beat this to death a little bit, but I'm having an issue, I think, with maybe we've split the hairs so much that I'm confused about them, but it's, what are we trying to regulate exactly? The person who is applying it, or the company that it's being applied at? For instance, do you get what I'm trying to say? So if a City of Sherwood landscaper sprays on a City of Sherwood commercial building something, whose responsibility is that? And if a company from Hillsborough, who's responsible?
Property owner.
Yeah, again, I know that the onus is on
But as
owner.
a property owner, how can I be liable for business practices of a contractor I've hired? That's the question I'm asking, because that's a valid question.
And I think you know a quick response is so long as you know what the ordinance is, and so long as you in good faith have provided your selected contractors information, at that point
You're operating in good faith.
Exactly.
You're as a consumer, we shop around. We know if you're going to hire True Green or, you know,
I hear what you're saying. I don't know.
And probably right is with their contract with whoever's applying it, and they'll have to make sure, otherwise they're going to be the one who suffers the consequences. So
again,
it'll be incumbent on them, and they will, to make sure when they sign a contract that they have provisions in there that basically say, you know, you need to do X, Y, Z, and Q, so I don't get fined.
So property owner, not business owner, property owner. That's my point, is that's two different things. I don't own my business. I don't own my property, but I own my business. And I have a landscaper who is licensed in the City of Sherwood. So does he follow the rule? Do I follow the rule? Or does my landlord follow the rule?
Well, typically what would happen is, so you're renting the property, and typically your commercial lease would cover that. And oftentimes what you'll do in a commercial lease is you'll make your tenant responsible for anything they did that was in violation of state, federal, or local law.
Okay.
So if you didn't have something like that in your rental agreement, then presumably the owners of the property would be responsible.
So does it say that in the ordinance, or does the ordinance say, you know what I'm trying to see what I'm trying to get at? I'm unclear about who is following this rule. Who are we targeting at this point?
Yeah, everybody's responsible, and I guess
because we're saying property owners.
It would also be the owner, because that's the easiest way to handle it. The owner, by contract in their lease, you know, has a way to put that responsibility on another party. But ultimately, it's like the same thing, sort of the same problem you have like with utilities. You know, you have a tenant, they move in. You know, it's what your code says about who's ultimately responsible. And if you have a provision that says it's the owner, and the owner didn't put something in their lease that said you are responsible for, you know, like that's it's the easiest way to do it in the code is to make the owner of the property responsible, and then they can contractually obligate other people.
So the person who is applying the offensive chemical is never held responsible unless they're the owner.
The contract with that company would need to specify that. So the owner of the property has in the case example, has an agreement with a tenant, and then the tenant, let's say, goes out and makes a contract with a chemical spray company. Ultimately, they're in that contract. They need to specify you're responsible for upholding all federal, state, and local Sherwood. You know.
So at that point, if I have not posted my signs, and somebody says, Rachel, you did not post your signs, and I say, I shouldn't have to post signs, this contract says they will use only green materials, it's off of me and on them.
Yeah.
Okay.
You operated in good faith. They agreed to do it. If they're really not to do it, then it's probably a legal court matter at that point, right?
Okay. but right, okay. So whose responsibility is to clean it up and react to it?
The owners.
No.
Okay, I mean, I'm sorry,
Yeah, I mean,
how do we get it cleaned up? I mean, we're figuring out who's personally responsible, and we're figuring out who's legally responsible, but who cleans it up?
Do you want to take this?
I mean, in terms of that next step, it would be, I mean, the owner is still ultimately going to be responsible for.
So when we write the ordinance, the term will be property owner, not business owner.
I mean, I think the easiest way to handle it would be the property owner.
Okay.
Because otherwise, I just think it's too cumbersome to try to,
Sure.
carve out these.
So then the city of Sherwood would enforce any violation on the property
On
owner.
the property owner, and it's on the property owner to.
The property owner could
Okay.
take action against either the tenant or the subcontractor if,
Okay.
if allowed by
If
their
there was a
contract.
violation. And that would be a contractual based on a contractual violation.
I mean, I totally get that part. I totally get that if I bought something in good faith or contracted in good faith, but that doesn't help me clean, that doesn't, as a citizen of Sherwood, help me get it cleaned up. So that's where I'm going with it is, somebody's got to start
At
it.
that point, it would probably fall into the hazardous materials issue.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's when DEQ step in, just like they did at Target and Wilsonville and everything else, because now all of a sudden you have a public health issue and everything else. My guess is in that type of situation, it's got a half-life and they're just going to wait till it goes away, because otherwise you're going to have to cut all the trees down or whatever.
Right.
That's
Put bags over there.
practical. So that would probably be handled under a different code section. The one thing that we might want to consider too is, depending on how we put this together with penalties and stuff, that having, especially if we do put it on the owner, having some sort of period of time to bring this in, because people aren't going to go redo their contracts overnight with their landscape services. Those are probably 1 or 2 year contracts, and so we'll have to make sure that,
Like new contracts that are phased in over a period
Yeah,
of time.
we contract with a few, not a ton, and we're tiny, so if we're doing it, yeah, although we already do it for you.
But I think maybe we've given you guys enough to work on, and then maybe report back to us in next meeting.
We've given them too much to work on.
Do you feel confident? Just with, yeah, okay. So the next item on the agenda is a general discussion for the committee on waste removal for businesses within Sherwood. And our intention of placing this on the agenda is multifaceted. And as I was doing some reading and reviewing of other towns within Oregon, it seems to me that a lot of the discussion of waste removal can oftentimes fall under nuisances. Because commercial property owners certainly do have, based on how their buildings are tenanted, a lot of waste, a lot of different kinds of waste. I feel like we have an opportunity, again, to encourage a best practice within the city. And some of the things that, I've just jotted down are things like styrofoam packing materials, bubble wrap, plastic bags, glass, in particular, recycling of light bulbs, those kinds of things. And then, of course, the chemicals, but we've discussed that, medical waste, and there's already regulations about that. But Tom, can you talk a little bit about whether or not we do have anything currently that addresses this for commercial property owners?
Well, we do have some things. It's up to the committee, but you actually have an expert here, Mike Leichner, who owns Pride Disposal. So if you really want good intel and information on this, you could always invite Mike up and ask him to address some of these issues. So
We cordially invite you, Mike.
I have a question. I've heard that a lot of modern
Do we need, for the record, to get him at the table with a mic?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Mike.
So my question is, a lot of the modern day products that we consume have a very short life, maybe 6 months, in general. They're just cheaply made, and so they end up in the landfill more quickly than they did like 40 years ago, and things are made of better materials and that sort of thing. So where does where does the waste go to? Which landfill?
The solid waste from Sherwood goes to Riverbend Landfill in Greenville.
Okay.
So based on some of the things that I brought up, Mike, can you talk a little bit about what options are available currently for commercial property owners and what you're witnessing?
Well, currently styrofoam block, we're taking that at our depot for recycling.
Mm-hmm.
We're not taking the crumbled pieces or the small pieces just because of the handling issues of that.
So can we
Sure.
do a back and forth? So I know a lot of commercial properties, there's containers that haulers will allow for commingling of waste. Is the styrofoam and the bubble wrap and those kinds of things, does the City of Sherwood allow commingling of those kinds of products?
Those items are not currently collected in the commingling, mainly because of the separation process. It would make it real difficult, and there's not much market for some of that material.
So how are those items stored for your pickup?
Which items?
Oh, like this?
Styrofoam and bubble wrap.
Yeah.
We don't currently collect those. We could. It'd be a fee form, a special fee to send a special truck out. But most people come into our depot on a regular basis with the styrofoam, film plastic. However, the film plastic and a lot of the plastics, because of the green fence, if you've done any reading on that, they've really curtailed the recycling markets for the plastics at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So do they end up in landfill?
Well, currently all the material has been collected that they can't process or can't move to China. You might see 5 or 6 types of recycled plastic in one bale that they would accept over there. They're not accepting it unless it's clean and separated by each individual. But so some of the processors that have got a large inventory of this are breaking those bales apart and trying to separate them back out of the individual plastic. So they're doing the cost. And the big fear is you load up a container ship full of this material and send it halfway across the ocean. China says we don't want it, and they'll send it back.
So why did Pride stop accepting hard plastic?
Because of the green fence, there was just not a market for that. We're still working with a couple different processors to see if we can find a market that will take those, and if we can, then we'll start collecting again.
Oh, okay. So was it China that is no longer?
The main issue on the West Coast where most of the market for the plastics is.
Since you don't have pickup currently for some of these materials, do you find that properties just put it in with the regular garbage?
There is some of that thrown away, and then some they're bringing it separated and bringing it into the market, into the depot of the items we're taking. But when there's no market for it, the landfill is the final market.
When you say when there's no market, you mean after you get it?
Correct.
So
And we're not a market, we're just a handler and shipper. And
I think we're more trying to address how the commercial companies get it to Pride, right? And what they get to Pride. I'm assuming that you will do the garbage service at the development.
which, you mean the one that's...
Any new developments at
Yes.
this point that are on the...
Pretty sure, yes.
Yes, okay. Sorry, I just wanted to...
So I guess let me see if I'm not sure I understand this, so let me ask a question. So what you're saying is even if they were to separate the materials out and you were to take it, eventually somewhere along the process change it would get moved back into the solid waste disposal anyway.
Well, we wouldn't accept it if there isn't a market for it. That's part of the reason why we quit taking some of the plastics, because there is no place to unload our trucks. And we'll recycle anything we can, but when the truck's full, we have to be able to unload it for the next day, and that's the issue, is there's not a place taking it at this time.
So if someone was to separate out styrofoam, let's say, and there was no market for it,
They wouldn't take it.
and you took it, then you would basically just put it in the landfill anyway.
That would be ultimately what we have to do, short of buying every warehouse space in the county and trying to fill it and hope it becomes available later on.
Mike, can I ask you a question? What recommendations would you have for businesses if we were going to write ordinances on waste disposal and recycling? Is there something specific that you would have in mind that you'd like to see all Sherwood businesses recycle, like, you know, mandatory recycling of batteries or light bulbs or...
Well, currently, light bulbs, we take those at our depot for recycling. batteries. We're taking batteries at our depot for recycling. Some jurisdictions offer that extra items like batteries at the curbside, but there's a cost to that. So I think there's a balance between what citizens are willing to pay versus what they want to recover. And that's more of a decision the council will make based on what the citizens of this community would like.
Yeah, I think they're specifically talking about commercial.
Yeah.
Commercial business.
Commercial property,
Commercial
yeah.
property.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
It just depends on what the business want to do. If they want to set it aside and say, I want a program, and we have enough program, we can establish a collection program for that. It's just a matter of sitting down and seeing what the cost would be, have the city approve a rate schedule and/or rebate if it's got a value, because all of the recycling revenue that we collect from sale of materials is part of the revenue that we use to offset some of the garbage costs. So you'll have garbage costs and revenue, and then they find a balance. And so as the material goes up in value or more volume, your rates just show less of an impact of increases.
So the more that we recycle, the less the garbage pickup costs?
Well, when you finally move, where you see the savings is maybe you have a 2-yard dumpster and then you recycle enough, you go to a 1-yard dumpster, so you see that reduction. However, since there's duplication of cost, you're never going to get to that free service because material will never be worth that to cover the cost.
Mm-hmm.
Ultimately, if you can downsize or eliminate your garbage because between what you purchase, how you purchase, and what you recover, that's where you see your savings.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Would you offer an incentive or discount to a large retailer because of the volume of trash that they'll be producing?
No, all the rates are set up in the jurisdiction, in most jurisdictions in the state, and say that if you have 2 yards of garbage and your neighbor does, you pay the same rate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's but the commercial businesses also, if there's dry waste, which is mostly retail, not your grocery stores, those loads come into our facility and we dump them and we run them over a sort line, and we do pull out as much as we can based on the markets. Because obviously everything we pull out we don't pay a dump fee for. So that's our incentive to pull it out.
So, do you have any way, and I'm thinking if we wanted to go somewhere what we talked about in the last topic of incentivizing businesses as the city or certifications of green practices, do you currently have a way to metric or measure which businesses or any location, I suppose, but we're talking about businesses, what their percentage of solid waste versus recycle is, or would that be a burden that you guys don't currently undertake?
The best we could probably do is show the total tonnage that we pick up in the city of Sherwood commercial businesses, and then show the commercial recycling tonnage, and that would give you a percentage by weight.
But as a whole, not individually.
Correct. It would, because there's no onboard scales that are accurate enough that would meet that criteria. That would not slow us down immensely.
Well, and as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have a little limit on size too for some of the containers. Like for instance, now that we compost, we don't need as large of a trash can,
Right.
but we can't get a smaller one.
I'm not sure what size, but you can. The smallest garbage commercial container would be what you normally would call a 1-yard container, 1 cubic yard, which is about 6+ cans.
Mm-hmm.
If you have less than that on a weekly basis, you can go to a roll cart, and that one touch you down to, say, a 90-gallon cart, which would be half of a 1 yard,
Mm-hmm.
or a 60 or a 30, as you see on most homes.
So there's no minimum for a business.
No.
I have a question.
You need to downsize your garbage.
When I toured your facility,
I'm paying too much.
and when we toured your facility, we saw the conveyor belt going up, so people were sorting the trash and whatnot. There's a lot of cardboard, and they were saying that most of that trash coming in was from retailers and commercial
Yeah,
distributors.
we're allowed to sort our dry waste, which we call dry, as basically has non-petrusable or no food waste in it, or very little.
Right. So maybe if you had an incentive, like say for cardboard or film plastic with businesses in town, that would relate to what you were talking about.
Well, there's 2 ways to approach that. One that's currently that we use is if they have we have a customer that we know the driver sees it in a container, or it's a large roll-off, compactor, and it has a lot of recyclable material in it. There's 2 ways to go back to the customer and say, because you have 50% recycling of that, we give them a reduced tipping fee because obviously there's less cost for us out our back door.
Mm-hmm.
The other incentive is we tell them, if you put that in your commingled container, you won't pay for that volume in that container, and you would be able to reduce your garbage fee.
And on the flip side, if if recycling is contaminated, then there's an additional fee that would be imposed potentially to whomever is
Correct. If they
yeah.
put it out for recycling and the driver gets there and sees it's contaminated, we give them an option.
Yeah.
Clean it up, we'll come back. If they don't, it dumps it, and it requires our driver to come in, dump the load, we have to pick through it and separate it. There could be a charge for that time and materials, and that can get, as driver and truck hours, that's pretty expensive.
Yeah, I mean, when I was talking about waste, which is something that I hear people say a lot when we talk about these large developments, I guess I personally was not assuming that the company in charge of picking up that waste would be the one to incentivize.
Mm-hmm.
They could though. They have
I mean, but why should it cost his company money for their company to do the right thing?
Right.
Well, and I guess
I don't understand why.
Those
Pride
companies
should
that have a lot of
incentivize.
recycled material, they look at the bottom line and say, gee, if I pull it out and
Right.
pay the garbage man, I'm saving that much money.
Right, and I guess I'm not
Some
trying
do
to
have
say
internal balers
Agree,
for
though.
cardboard
That
or
kind of makes
sheet film and stuff, and they send it off.
Right.
So,
I mean, what I'm trying to say is if we do a better job sorting our food waste and blah, 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 at Fat Miles, it ends up costing me less money. So if I'm watching my bottom line, I should be doing that anyway. But if my bottom line is so huge that I don't need that extra $65 a month, I'm not going to pay attention to it. And I don't feel like Pride should have to carry the expense or incentivize.
in your case, if you pull all the food waste out of your container, whatever's left over is dry waste, which might be just packaging or whatever that's not recyclable. The other option the city put in place last year was that container you could double the size and go every other week, which is a thing, and that's another 6 or 8% reduction. So we offered that because at that point there's nothing to give off an odor or vector issue because there's no food waste in it.
So Mike, do you require or do you encourage or businesses to have commingled and separate?
Yes, in the newsletter we send out every month or every other month, and we also do a lot of promotions on that. Around the festival we have a booth promoting our recycling program. We also have, the county does a lot of outreach with grants from Metro, and we've had a person in the field trying to try to touch base with the businesses at least twice a year. Unfortunately, she had a family issue, so she had to leave, and so we're still looking at replacing that person.
Yeah, I was going to say, when I called, she came out.
No,
And
it would have been Nancy.
It was Nancy, and she came out and explained to me exactly what my options were, how much they would be, how I could save money, the 2 week, all of those things. I mean, so I felt as though Pride was doing everything. I know she was fantastic.
Yeah.
So
We're going to replace.
I felt like Pride was doing everything they could to give me the information that I needed to do what was responsible, but it was still on me to do the responsible practice. So I guess where I feel like I don't know what kind of an ordinance we could have, but possibly related to the size of container and size of building.
Well, and I mean, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
You were going to talk about that point.
Yeah, I am. I think the intention is for the city of Sherwood to establish a coordinated program to responsibly encourage commercial property owners to dispose of materials in a
Green fashion.
in a responsible approach. Using the word green can just be so challenging, but in as a responsible manner as folks are able. And I don't even want to say practical because it's not practical for a lot of folks. People don't consider recycling easy at times. People don't consider disposing of things as it's not fun. So it's difficult to do that. And as I think about my tenants and I think about the owners that are my clients, it's difficult for folks like Mike and the disposal companies, like you said, to incentivize these issues. But I think that this is another opportunity that the city of Sherwood can establish some coordinated programs on collection and accumulation of these products and perhaps streamline the kinds of things that large commercial businesses are bringing into our city. So perhaps there's an opportunity to limit the use of the bubble wrap, or limit the kinds of packing materials that are used as inventory is being brought into our city. Now, I don't know if that is the case or not, but it could perhaps be something, something that we could look at.
Some towns have done that where they ban plastic bags. So then you don't have all the film plastic to deal with, and it doesn't get intermixed with the other garbage. It's kind of hard to pull out, I think. It tends to be soiled. And
So I wanted to thank you for coming, and I wish I would have known we maybe could have moved you to the front of the agenda instead of the end and had to speak earlier.
He was really wanted to be here. He just happened to be there.
The one question I'm curious about is, I mean, and this kind of goes back to something Tom mentioned earlier, which I think I continue to think about now on every topic is what is is there a problem or a potential problem that we're trying to solve, or are we just doing things because we think maybe they're good things to do, and that isn't necessarily a bad thing. But so I'm curious, like Target specifically comes to mind. What's your experience with their garbage and waste handling and their practices? Is there a huge opportunity for them to do a better job? Are they doing a pretty good job?
Before you answer that, as opposed to maybe singling out Target, perhaps you could speak more to the collection of larger commercial users within the city without identifying those users.
Well, like I said earlier, we're in the interim, we're bringing somebody back on board to go back out and talk to businesses about recycling programs and efficient garbage collection. The retail businesses and almost all the commercial have some kind of commingled container, so they are recycling. Some do a really good job, but everything that fits in there that they can put in there that's appropriate. Some do a decent job and say, well, I'm too busy to take that last box of cardboard out, and I'll just toss it in the closest container. Of those, when it goes in the garbage, when we run our commercial routes, we run two different routes, if you want to call that a dry and wet. There again, the restaurants, not the ones that are suffering food waste, that's the third truck that goes out. So you can see the layers of complexity here, and then it's for commercial, and then you have four different trucks in residential. But on the commercial side, we run, most of it's done at night, because we're a 24/7 business, so that's part of the reason why I've been listening to some of it, because of those issues. That the night route picks up a lot of the industrial parks and office buildings that have little of no food, maybe a couple lunch sacks, but basically it's office paper. We get a lot of that in our recycling program, but there's still some that goes in there. It's amazing. Those loads do go over our sort line. We run the commercial route besides the drop box trucks, and we run them over and we pull out a lot of paper, cardboard, and we have to control how much we have to pull out. There's a percentage that we have to pull out. But the main thing is they come out and do sampling every so often, random sampling of our loads coming off the end of the belt, and make sure that the amount of wood, cardboard, and metal is of a size that's so small a person physically can't pull it out. And they've got a little square box that they put in there, and if it touches in it, and then they weigh it to see what our percentage that we've missed. And we're using anywhere from 0 to 2% of mixed items going by of those items. So we get 98% of the wood and metal and cardboard, as well as glass. We do pull out glass and plastic, some plastics. What else are we pulling out? I mean, motors, electric motors, aluminum, and it's all done by hand. So the crew does a really good job out there on that. And it can be a pretty tough job in the middle of December or in the middle of August.
So, Mike, is it fair to say that they would pay less if they did it themselves? So essentially what some people are choosing to do is basically choosing to pay you to do it?
That's correct. If they choose to save the money and they separate it out, the system handles it. If they choose not to, then they pay the regular rate that somebody's just throwing sheer garbage away, and then we try to pull it out in order to save our disposal fee off the back.
Doesn't it cost me more money to compost? Don't I pay a little bit more now that I compost?
The way the lanes were set up,
And that's not a blaming thing. I'm just saying I think I have to pay a little more to
For example,
compost.
if you had a 3-yard container, which is food and regular trash out of your back door, and you decided I can compost, and you take 1 yard of food waste and then 2 yards of dry, so you have 2 now containers, that total monthly bill is just a little bit less than what your original bill was. Because Sherwood has a unique system they've had for years of a heavy rate and a light rate.
Right.
The heavy rate being food waste generators that would have other stuff. And so they can go to light rate on both containers, and that's the process, plus another 6% on the dry container if you just go every other week on it.
Right. And the overhead cost to a company to do
Your internal cost
is higher.
yes.
Because the compostable bags is higher.
And you have more labor because
That's
you have
right.
to have training and
Yeah.
somebody watching.
We have more bins.
Mhm.
And we, frankly, don't do a great job of it, and we're a very small organization. We have 1 garbage can that collects food. So my point being, there's not necessarily, I feel like, an economic incentive for a company to do this. So when,
It's what we call low-hanging fruit, and those that are doing it because they want to do it and it's the right thing.
that's right.
The next level, which is going to be the bulk of it, is going to take, it's going to cost as much industry thinks that the next level of food waste recycling commercial is probably going to cost the industry as much as the first 50% of recycling we've gotten out of the system now, because of just the sheer cost and all the weights right there.
Yeah, and you don't have much cardboard, so.
Oh, I have a lot of cardboard.
Oh, do you?
My recycling bin is the biggest thing we have. I mean, everything comes in a cardboard box because it's recyclable. It's the greenest way. My point is, I feel like a company is not going to do it on their own because they're going to save money.
And so that's where I'd like to maybe circle back to ask Tom and Heather to maybe explore opportunities that we might have to, and I'm looking and referring to Jackson County, has a sanitation code that's got some great information in terms of collection and disposal and those kinds of things. And I'm wondering what we can do that would require commercial property owners to follow or implement a more sustainable practice of disposal, because that's what we want for the city.
Well, I'd like to get feedback from the rest. I guess I have one thing that I'd like to add to the conversation, and that is a lot of this isn't under an ordinance because we only have 1 provider, whereas the county might have multiple providers and reasons to do sanitation codes. So we manage this under a franchise agreement with Pride, which currently is under review. I believe we'd hired someone to come in for the first time in a long time to actually look through rates and practices and advise the city on things that we can change. So one option would be for us to take a look at some of the things that we've talked about here to do that, because from what I heard, I'm not really sure that there's a major problem here that we can solve that isn't being solved in one way or another. Maybe it's not the most, maybe it's our commercial and other users aren't being as socially responsible as we would like them to be, but it's still getting handled, and they're just choosing to pay for it in a different way. But that's kind of up for you guys to decide. I'm just
Yeah, I'm actually, my question to the rest of the committee is what specifically do we feel like we're trying to accomplish here? Having heard this testimony and, what's happening either by commercial users or at the facility afterwards, and what the limitations are as far as, measuring specific companies. And I'm not really clear on what it is we're trying to proceed, or how we're trying to proceed on this specific topic.
I think so. Okay. Do you want to?
All I would say is that while I agree with encouraging recycling and good practices, I don't feel that it's necessary to put an ordinance to require it from people. I think any retailer coming in they have to recycle, or they have to pay to get that stuff out. Or to have them throw away the amount of cardboard that a large retailer would be coming in, or the amount of recyclable material, that would cost them a lot.
And I think, bottom line, I would hope, it's just my opinion, that yes, people are going to recycle to some extent. It's all our personal choice as to how much, and whether we want to compost everything and get by with a little tiny garbage can, or we're going to do this and get by with a little bit bigger garbage can. So I don't necessarily see, especially after talking to Mike here, who's been so gracious, thank you very much, that there's a big problem that needs our committee to solve.
Well, I think the problem that people are talking about in the petitions is that it's the product, and that will end up in the landfill. But I don't know how we could regulate that with an ordinance.
Product being made in China product.
That's cheaply made.
So do you come up with an ordinance that all retailers have to sell stuff made in America?
Strong, good quality.
We'd have a difficult time. Yeah.
But maybe we could tie this into the green label. If a retailer is really great about sorting their waste, maybe they could get a green star.
Well, that's what I was trying to get at about the measurement, and it doesn't sound like they have that. I mean, unless we went only by the size of the cart, this much of their waste, they have this size of a cart for recycling and this size for garbage, and that meets our threshold for the green label. That might be the most practical way if we wanted to go that route.
And to promote it by saying you'll save money.
Right. And we've done that on other residential. We have an incentive program, I believe, that's still in place. Is that gone now? We used to.
Yeah, initially, 15, 20 years ago, I think that the council was unhappy with the participation at the residential level of recycling, so they said, okay, we're going to add $1 to the bill, and they can get it back as a credit if they recycle. And it was pretty successful getting a percentage of participation up, so then they said, well, let's go to $2, and then they went to $4. And now it's a point where we went, because of the building system, it really created issues for us, and we asked, and besides, now the peer pressure is so much that if you're not recycling, the neighbor's going to say, where's your recycling? So the incentive is already there. It doesn't need to be financial. And for the customers that have a lot of cardboard, several stores and chains will have their own baler, and they'll ship it back in their own internal rigs back to the distribution point, and then they sell it from there. And there's several of the large stores that may be coming in or may not be coming in or whatever. I will have to say that they're one of the most aggressive food waste recyclers in the country. The state of Oregon, every store is pretty much doing some kind of food composting, and they're pushing it really hard. And they said it may cost us more, but they're dedicated to that. So it's just changing the culture one by one.
I have a question about the life of the McMinnville landfill. Do you know how many more years they have there? And
they're in the process of expanding that landfill on current site footprint. And I think they just received, or in the process of receiving, like a 2-year extension while they go through this planning and application process. But as far as long term, I don't have that.
Because I know landfills are getting filled everywhere, so I'm wondering if there's a site closer to Sherwood that you're considering using, or you're going to burn it at a waste management facility. Or
the issue with the solid waste in the metro area is until the end of 2019, they're obligated to send 90% of the general purpose landfill, which is the trussable waste, has to go to a waste management landfill. So either up in Arlington or McMinnville within the state of Oregon, basically. After that contract, who knows what Metro's going to do. There are 2 or 3 other landfills twice as far away as McMinnville, or you've got Corvallis, the Dalles. But you have 3 regional landfills up in the gorge within 50 miles of each other: Arlington, Roosevelt, and Coffin Butte, which are up in the gorge.
And they burn, right? They create energy and burn.
Each landfill is dealing with generating energy or collecting methane and putting it back in the grid. They're all experimenting with that. Those 3 landfills, between the 3 of them and the options of land up there, because there's no rainfall, it really reduces any issues with the pollutants that go through that, have the potential to take all of the garbage in the Northwest for the next 200-300 years. So there's plenty of landfill capacity in the Northwest.
Quick question on a little bit of a different topic, still dealing with waste. Do we have fencing type requirements or enclosure type requirements within the city in terms of maintaining beautification standards and that sort of thing?
We do. It depends on, well, certainly for new developments, we definitely have standards. I would say that they're all beautiful, but they certainly do screen the containers from site. So
Okay.
That's definitely part of the code. That's definitely been required as part of developments that have come in recently or may come in
Great.
the future.
In the interest of time, I'd like, and I don't feel like there's a lot of consensus around proceeding in any particular direction, so I'd like to suggest that we not proceed at this time on any ordinance in this realm, but reserve the right to approach it in a future meeting if we decide we want to.
I would agree with that.
And I wanted to add one thing to the agenda in the future. I was to propose that is to talk about having standards for green or LEED certified buildings on retail spaces over 65,000 square feet. Because I know there are some, like for the new proposed development, that have been discussed and that they could readily be applied. It's just a matter of, the city saying, this is what we want.
Okay. On that note, maybe we should talk a little bit about our agenda for Monday. On Wednesday, when Chad was with us, we discussed talking about, thank you, Michael. Okay, thank you very much for your time. So we talked a little bit with Chad on Wednesday about very specifically the ordinances that were proposed at recent council meetings. And Doug, you mentioned that you went through those topics. Could you give a brief synopsis of what you remember in terms of the wage issue?
Well, we talked about discussing that at Monday's meeting,
Correct.
And Beth specifically wanted to pursue looking at the Large Retailer Accountability Act in Washington, D.C. I also know that Santa Fe, New Mexico passed a wage ordinance several years ago that's in effect, and San Francisco, California has a higher minimum wage across the board, no exceptions. Those are the only three municipalities that I've been able to find that have any living wage or minimum wage law that applies to private employers. The other 120 to 150 all apply to either government employers, companies that contract directly with the local government, or companies that receive direct tax incentives from local government. And in my research, I came across Oregon Revised Statute 653.017, which would seem to clearly preclude us from pursuing any wage standards outside of those three exceptions I just listed. And we asked Chad to follow up on that particularly.
Yes, it is using CPMs by state law. Sorry. From enacting, a higher minimum wage than what's been set by the state. So, yeah, and just doing some very preliminary research that it wouldn't, especially like if you had it worded the way the Washington D.C. Language is worded, it's basically it's raising the minimum wage in D.C. too. It didn't really have any other provisions. They called it the Large, Retailer Accountability Act, but
that was the only issue in that.
I do believe that there might be more, different other types of provisions that they were enacting to make them more responsible, but really the main thrust of it was a living wage, like a higher wage rate. And it was specifically targeted at Walmart because there's a number of Walmarts that are set to open in
So we would not be able to do anything like that?
Not in Oregon. You wouldn't, all of the local governments are precluded from doing that. It was enacted in early, I think it was like 2002 is when it went into effect. But it was a lot of the big retailers were behind the state law. So
the only area around a wage, a minimum wage floor that we could target would be companies that do direct business with the city.
yes, you could look at, I mean, there are exclusions to that, you know, in terms of, it would apply to large retailers, like you wouldn't be able to do that.
Yeah.
You can set it for public contract.
And there's a lot of cities in Oregon that have done that, or not a lot, but there's a handful of cities in Oregon that have done that. But it would, I mean, just off the top of your head, Tom, you know, who would something like that apply to potentially? Other, obviously, capital contractors or capital improvement contractors would be. Other than that, I mean, potentially, what in town would something like that apply to?
Well, the typical type of contracts we have, and I'm not sure I'm answering your question. I told you my ability to respond is down at 9:30. But yeah, typical type of contracts we have are certainly contracts, public contracts for construction type projects. We also have personal services contracts with all sorts of different vendors for janitorial services, which we actually have to use the state's list in order to enter those contracts. That's another thing that the state kind of required local jurisdictions to pick off of their list, so we can't just hire anybody. But, you know, we hire attorneys, we hire all sorts of different things. I don't think we'd hire a large big box retailer, but I know our public works, you know, they go to Home Depot fairly often because they need parts to fix and maintain and do things. But
that's probably not in a direct contract. It's probably going to buy and reimburse.
I think the only, I don't even think we have a contract with landscapers, yeah,
sure.
for that structure. I was trying to think, we do a lot of work with Staples, but I don't think we have a contract with them. I think we still just, you know,
Just an account.
an account, yeah.
So, given those limitations, is the living wage ordinance something that the committee still feels like we should pursue, knowing that it could only apply to very limited government contract situations, or does that interest now no longer exist?
I think my interest has waned, and it doesn't seem like something that we could, you know, put into effect.
I mean, it's not going to affect Walmart. That's
No.
the bottom line.
No, or any retailer.
Right.
And that was my big thing coming into this committee, is that this is a little bit bigger than Walmart. It affects all retailers present and the ones that may come into town. So if we can't do anything like that, I don't see why there's any need, in my opinion, to pursue something like that. You guys' thoughts?
Well, were there any exemptions that we would have the opportunity to pursue?
I mean, you have under the public, if it's a public contract, I believe for public employees, you know, you could do it for the, you know, the city would have to pay it. And then I think there was a third one, and I can't remember it off the top of my head. But
The third one was if there was a direct tax incentive or abatement, you could put that in the contract. You know, that the tax incentive or abatement would require a higher wage.
A tax incentive or abatement by the city?
By the city, yeah.
Okay.
And it having to be a direct, the word direct was in there.
And I'm assuming we don't have any tax abatement going on in this situation.
We do not.
Thank you.
The living wage is not just the salary or the dollar per hour amount. It's the hours, you know, a dependable schedule. So somebody who's working part-time can, you know, work another second job. So I think that we should still discuss to see what we can do.
I totally agree with that, and it, you know, that was the question I was asking the other night. I mean, you have a living wage, which is specifically that wage, but then you have this whole other package of, and to me those are separate things together but separate, a whole other package of, you know, hours, workers' rights, all the things that we're talking about, and those are still on the table, and maybe that should be our agenda for Monday.
So if I might make a suggestion that we table this discussion, given the hour, and Rachel and I can work to list this as broadly as we're able to for Monday's agenda. So that way, when additional committee members are here, they have an opportunity to chime in on the discussion. Is everyone okay with tabling the discussion till next week?
Absolutely. Monday.
Monday.
I just want to be clear, are we not dealing with trying to raise the minimum wage?
Well, Beth Cook isn't here, and she really wanted to be in.
But 5 of us are here. And I guess I feel like I need to understand if we're letting that go, because it's been made clear by the attorney that
I don't think we
It's
can.
not going to affect the retailers in town, so do we want to pursue affecting public contracts? Or do we consider that to be an issue we don't particularly want to address at this time?
Well, again, I mean, I feel like we can table the discussion of the parameters upon which we want to look at until Monday, if that's okay with everyone. And that way we can
Reserve the right to bring that back in if we.
Yeah, if in between now and Monday, the city attorney's office has found some kind of an option or opportunity, fantastic. And if it becomes an issue that we're unable to explore, well, that will be then clear.
So I'd like to ask that for the Monday agenda, and I think we've agreed we're going to cover the other workers' rights issues. I hope that's what we're talking about. I'd like to ask that we try to break those up into separate topics as much as possible, because altogether it becomes pretty large, and we end up doing a lot of bouncing around but never really progressing on any one item. So that would be my request, is that we say, here's the 5 areas of workers' rights that we're concerned about that we want to write a specific piece of legislation about, and then let's talk through them one by one instead of lumping them all together where it becomes harder to really make progress.
I would agree. And I think kind of in our minds we each know what those 4 or 5 issues are, and just we'll come in, start on Monday, and we'll be able to concentrate on this, all together.
I just also ask that we not only come up with an idea of that, but we need to have a threshold to which what businesses these are going to apply for. And we need to have that sooner rather than later.
Well, I think there's 2 ways to approach that. We either discuss, and to me, the threshold should be the same for all 5 of them, or
That's
however
my
many there are.
right.
So I think we either establish a threshold up front and then start talking specifics, or we talk specifics up front and then figure out what the threshold is. And I'm open to either one, but I think that...
That's my point, because it starts to affect different businesses in different ways and very minute detail, and I'm not interested in trying to explore.
If I recall correctly, the letters that were signed were somewhere between 50 and 75,000 square feet of businesses. Is that correct? Am I correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways we could go. I think rather than getting into specifics now, I think we should agree. Let's talk about what the threshold is first. Do we all want to do that first?
Yeah, I think that's reasonable.
And then once we establish
and we
the
make
threshold.
the decision about whether we're going to address living wage. I'm sorry, I know I keep bringing that up, but if it's off, that needs to be off and not come to the meeting.
I don't want to discuss that yet. I don't want to decide.
I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is we need to decide.
On Monday.
We need to decide.
Sure.
Okay. All
Because
right.
it comes up at every meeting, and at every meeting we decide we can't do anything.
Right, and nobody was here to hear the attorney, give our... So I would like to say, unless there's new information that comes to light, that maybe we lead the meeting and say, we've been told we can't produce a wage ordinance that's going to affect private employers. We're reserving the right to come back to that later, but that's not on our agenda tonight. We're going to talk about other workers' rights, such as these, and we're going to talk about thresholds.
Yeah, sorry. Could you give us the specifics, like what state law exactly is making it impossible, and so we know? People will be asking.
I've been posting it, and I read it verbatim the other night. I can give you a copy of it right here as well, as she can as well.
That'd be great. So, for Monday's agenda, we're going to do, and this is, I'll draft this up for you, Sylvia, but we'll do a recap of, not a recap, excuse me. We'll do a review of some language that you're able to draft. Well, actually, you won't even be able to do that for Monday, and yeah, probably not. Yeah. Okay.
So can I say something here, because I think
Yes.
I think it might be beneficial for you guys to be thinking about as we move forward. I've kind of been looking at resources in general for this committee and the time frame that you have, and I was kind of waiting for tonight to see how tonight went, to see how much you guys got through, and it went pretty much as I expected. I think at best, you guys will be able to maybe produce 5 ordinances, but probably only 4. Given the amount of time that it takes to prepare these things, to bring them back for you guys to review them, to talk about them, to take it back and review, there's kind of this natural process of how these things get put together. And we do this all the time with land use and everything. And really, the best you can do is have 3 touches on each thing. So you did 2 tonight. You know, you covered 2 ordinances, but that's going to have to come back to you 2 more times before it's going to be acceptable to present to the council in a recommendation. And you're going to have probably not quite as much, but you'll still have a lot of conversation about the specifics as you start to see language and then polishing languages and everything else. So you guys have done a good job of focusing your attention on certain things, but I want to continue to encourage you to do that, because if you start to get more than 5 ordinances, my fear is that you will not be successful in being able to accomplish what you want to accomplish, and that's get the council good recommendations on these things. So you just might want to keep that in mind as you move forward. I've been trying to kind of look at what resources you've said you want to do, and kind of how long it takes to put these things together. And I think you should be targeting 4, maybe 5. And you've already have 2 that you've kind of gone over tonight. So you might want to think about how you're going to allocate your time and resources to make sure that you get that done.
Okay. I think that's a great recommendation, and thank you. So we will work on drafting a clear agenda for Monday as best we can, and I will get you the information by tomorrow. And we talked a little bit on Wednesday about discussing 24-hour operations within the city of businesses, and I apologize, it's getting quite late. I think we talked a little bit about whether or not we want to see additional large retailers come into the city, and what that threshold might look like. And so perhaps that's a conversation that we can push to later into next week.
Isn't that the purview of the Planning Commission and the zoning code? I mean, establishing limits on large retailer size. Is that even something we can cover?
Well, if you were going to, yeah, and I'm still thinking about Naomi's lead thing, whether that falls under chapter 16 or not, I'm not sure. But certainly, if you're going to say, well, we want to limit business sizes to X number of square feet, that would fall under chapter 16 of the planning code. And you know, it certainly wouldn't be inappropriate for you guys to think about that and have a conversation. May not be something you guys can accomplish here, but if it's something that's important to you,
maybe we could draft something for the council for.
So yeah, this is kind of our thoughts on that. I forgot what I was going to say. So, I guess just my recollection was, at least what I had written down, was we were going to try to cover the living wage stuff on Monday, and then on Thursday we're going to take a look at the 24-hour stuff. Maybe on Thursday there would be time to do the threshold conversation as well, since you're only tackling one thing on that day. I guess I have a question for Heather. Heather, do you think you guys can have some language put together for the 2 ordinances that we talked about tonight for the following Monday, or is that too quick?
We try. I mean, I definitely think we could have at least one of them ready. And I say that just assuming nothing happens. Not too many emergencies.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think definitely we can get one. We'll try to, I mean, if we stick with Eugene, should be easy, because it's, you know, pretty much will be wholesale what Eugene has. It'll just be some changes. So we can definitely get one. We'll aim for 2. But.
Okay, well, let's make sure we keep checking in with you guys as these meetings go along, because, you know, it might get to a point where we just need to cancel a meeting, because if you don't have text coming back to you to review, and we can only do a certain number of ordinances, then, you know, we'll have to look at workloads and resources, and we're really stretched here. I know staff is really stretched, because of all the other things we have going on. I know the burials are just really stretched too to try to meet this stuff. So let's keep an eye on that as we go forward, if that's okay.
Okay. And so with that in mind, perhaps rescheduling of a meeting here or there might be necessary so that we can review these as they're produced. Yes.
Yes, and obviously it would be nice to get them to you a day or two in advance,
Yeah.
especially if you're talking about reviewing text. Probably at least 2 days in advance would be good.
That would be
because you guys want to come in prepared to talk about what you read, what your ideas are, what you think's good, what you think's bad, and you can't do that when you're just sitting in front of here. So we'll have to take a look at that as well and make sure. I'm coordinating with burials, so I'll try to make sure that I communicate that with you, and we can go from there.
okay. Are there any closing comments or?
I'll never miss an opportunity to talk. Just briefly, and I wanted to review my findings and looking through the petitions. And thank you for that recommendation, by the way. It was valuable. I tallied them into, looks like about 7 or 8 different categories. By far and away, the number one category that people expressed concerns about was traffic. I'm not sure what we are going to be able to do, unfortunately, on this committee in relation to traffic. But I just want to point that out. The second and third items were about the same. I classified one of them under general community values. It was, you know, it was generalized statements, and I think those are important things. But it was hard to figure out specifically what action they would want to take based on that. And the other one that was kind of tied with that was just kind of general angst about Walmart. And so those were the second and third. The third, the fourth and fifth items were also tied, and it was fair wages and employee rights, kind of 2 separate but related things. And I think we're going to talk about that on Monday. So I think that's good that we're covering items that people care about. And then the next one was crime, and then there was a couple about hours of operation and parking.
All right. Well, with all of that said, thank you, everyone. Meeting adjourned.